Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. It was supposed to be a quick weekend getaway. Just me, my buddy Dave, and 2 nights of camping deep in the Hollow Valley woods, a spot that wasn't marked on any map, but Dave swore by it. He had been there once with his uncle when he was a kid, and he wouldn't stop talking about the perfect fishing, the untouched wilderness, and the isolation. No cell service, no tourists, no distractions. Sounded perfect. It took us half a day to hike in, the trail overgrown and barely recognizable as we moved deeper into the valley. The forest around us was dense, almost unnaturally so. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches forming a tangled web overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. But Dave was confident, leading the way with that grin of his, saying, "We're almost there, man. You're gonna love this spot." The deeper we went, the quieter the forest became. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but after a while, I realized I couldn't hear any birds or animals. No rustling in the bushes, no distant calls of wildlife. Just the sound of our boots crunching through the underbrush and the occasional creak of tree branches swaying overhead. "Does it always get this quiet out here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Dave shrugged, though he looked a little uneasy too. "It's an old place. Not a lot of people come out here anymore." We pushed on until we reached a small clearing, where the ground dipped into a shallow hollow. In the middle of it stood a cabin, old, worn, and almost hidden by the thick layers of moss and vines covering its wooden walls. I stopped in my tracks, staring at it. "I thought we were camping. You didn't mention a cabin." Dave frowned, as surprised as I was. "It wasn't here last time. At least I don't remember it." The cabin looked ancient. The roof sagged under the weight of time, the windows dark and empty, like black holes in the weathered wood. But something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there, or like it had been waiting for us. "Maybe we should set up camp a little further away," I suggested, trying to ignore the sudden chill creeping up my spine. Dave shook his head, always the adventurous one. "Nah, it'll be cool. Maybe we can check it out after we set up. Could be some old gear left behind." Reluctantly, I helped set up the tent a few yards from the cabin, but the unease never left me. The cabin loomed over us, casting long shadows as the sun began to dip behind the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, but every time I glanced at the windows they were empty, lifeless. As night fell, the forest around us seemed to close in even more. We sat around the campfire, the flames crackling softly, but the usual banter between us was missing. Dave stared at the cabin, his eyes fixed on the darkened windows. "You ever hear any stories about this place?" I asked, trying to break the silence. Dave shook his head. "Just the usual stuff. People don't come out here much. Some say it's haunted, but you know how people are. They make stuff up to keep kids away." I chuckled nervously, but deep down I wasn't so sure. Something about this place felt alive, like the trees were holding their breath, waiting for something. That's when we heard the knock. It was faint but unmistakable. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the cabin door. We both froze, staring at each other in disbelief. My heart pounded in my chest. We hadn't seen anyone out here, not for miles. There was no way someone could have just wandered up to that cabin without us noticing. Dave stood up, grabbing the flashlight. "Maybe it's an animal," he said, though his voice wavered. "No animal knocks," I muttered, my skin crawling with the growing sense of dread. He started toward the cabin, and despite every instinct screaming at me to stay put, I followed. The fire cast long, flickering shadows across the clearing as we approached the door. The wood creaked under Dave's hand as he pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The cabin was empty, or at least it seemed to be. The inside was sparse, just an old table, a few chairs, and a fireplace blackened with soot. The air inside was cold, far colder than it should have been, and that's when we saw it. On the table, a single piece of paper lay folded neatly. Dave picked it up, and as he unfolded it, his face drained of color. He handed it to me without a word. The note was short, written in a shaky hand. It read, "Don't stay the night. It watches." I laughed nervously, but it came out all wrong. Too high-pitched, too forced. Okay, very funny. You planned this, didn't you? But Dave wasn't laughing. He was staring at the far corner of the cabin, his flashlight shaking in his hand. I followed his gaze and felt the blood drain from my face. There, scratched into the wall, were dozens of symbols, circles, lines, strange runes I couldn't make sense of. They covered the wood, sprawling out like a madman's scrawl. And worse, next to the symbols, were names. Dozens of names, all etched deep into the wall, the oldest ones faded with time. At the very bottom of the list, freshly scratched into the wood, were 2 new names. My name and Dave's. We backed out of the cabin slowly, neither of us saying a word. The forest was dead silent again, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I wanted to leave, to pack up and get out of there, but something kept me rooted in place. That's when I saw it. In the darkened window of the cabin, something moved. A figure, tall, thin, its face pale and featureless, pressed against the glass, watching us. I grabbed Dave's arm, and we ran. We ran like hell through the woods, branches tearing at our skin, the cold air biting our lungs. But no matter how far we ran, the feeling never left, that we weren't alone, that something was following us. We made it back to the car at dawn, our legs burning, our breaths ragged. Without a word, we threw our gear into the trunk and peeled out of there, leaving the hollow in the cabin behind. We didn't talk about it on the drive back. We didn't talk about it for weeks. But late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows creep in, I sometimes hear it again. That knock. Faint, rhythmic, just outside my window. And I know deep down it's still watching. I'll never forget that night deep in the woods, how the darkness felt thick, suffocating, almost alive, the kind of black that presses in from all sides, swallowing your thoughts until the only sound is the rhythm of your own breathing. I wasn't even supposed to be out there. It was a spur-of-the-moment trip, a last-ditch effort to clear my head after months of work and stress had weighed me down. Just me, my backpack, and the wide, open forest of Black Ridge. The hike had been exhausting, and by the time I found a decent clearing to set up camp, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains. The ranger at the station, an older guy with a weathered face, had warned me to stick to the trails. His eyes were too serious for my liking, but I shrugged it off. I just needed one night away from it all. A fire, some stars, and silence. Silence. That was the first thing that started to bother me after I settled in. The usual forest sounds were absent. No rustling leaves, no insects buzzing, not even the distant call of an owl. Just stillness. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the crackling fire, the warmth against my face. But the quiet was unnerving, creeping into my bones. It wasn't until much later that I realized what should have tipped me off from the start. When the woods are quiet, it's because something out there has silenced them. I was dozing off when I heard it, something moving just beyond the glow of my fire. I sat up, straining my ears. A twig snapped, and then there was this soft, dragging sound. It stopped as soon as I stood up. I called out, my voice too loud in the unnatural silence. "Hello, who's there?" Nothing. Just more quiet. My heart started hammering in my chest. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam over the edge of the clearing, half expecting to catch the reflective eyes of some nocturnal creature. But the light revealed nothing. Only trees, their twisted limbs casting shadows like long skeletal fingers. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A low guttural growl. I froze. Whatever it was big. Bigger than a deer. The growl deepened, vibrating through the ground beneath my boots. I backed toward the fire, my eyes darting between the shadows, but still. Nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I heard a voice. Faint, almost familiar, but warped. It called my name. John. I whipped around, shining the light toward the sound, but I saw nothing. No one. The voice came again, closer now, but wrong. Too stretched, like a recording plate at half speed. Johnny, come here. Panic started bubbling up. I hadn't told anyone I was coming here. No one should know my name. And that's when I saw him, the park ranger. His figure materialized from the shadows, standing just beyond the light. Relief washed over me for a second. I almost laughed. It was just him, the guy from the station. He must have been out on patrol. But then he stepped forward and I saw his eyes. They were black, like oil slicks void of anything human. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as if he didn't quite know how to use his limbs. My stomach turned. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice cracking. He didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head, and that's when I noticed something horrifying. His skin wasn't right. It hung loosely like it didn't belong to him, stretched and sagging, as if it had been draped over his bones. "John," he whispered, his voice rasping, dragging out the syllables. "Come. With me." I stumbled back, heart racing, nearly tripping over my tent. This wasn't the ranger. This thing, whatever it was wearing him, like a grotesque costume. I bolted for the trees, leaving my gear and the fire behind, not daring to look back. Branches tore at my arms and face as I ran, blind and frantic, crashing through the underbrush. My lungs burned with every breath, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away. I could hear it. No, them. Following, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. And then I heard it again. Another voice, different this time. "John, over here." I skidded to a halt, almost collapsing from the sudden stop. Ahead of me stood another ranger, his flashlight flickering in the dark. This one looked real, his face lined with genuine concern. "Thank God," I gasped, staggering toward him. "There's something in the woods. It's—" "I know," he interrupted, his voice steady, but grave. "We need to move, now." Without waiting for my response, he grabbed my arm and pulled me along the trail. His pace was relentless, and I struggled to keep up. The sound of footsteps and rustling followed us, too close for comfort. Whatever it was, it hadn't given up the chase. As we rounded a bend in the trail, the ranger turned, his face illuminated by the moonlight. My heart dropped. His skin, it was too smooth, too perfect. And his eyes, black. Before I could scream, I felt cold fingers close around my neck from behind, yanking me back into the shadows. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the two rangers standing together, their faces splitting into identical, twisted smiles. Then silence. I woke up in the morning, sprawled on the ground next to the cold ashes of my fire. My gear was untouched, my body unharmed, but the forest, it was still, deathly still. I scrambled to my feet and ran all the way back to the ranger station. The older ranger was there, the real one, looking at me with concern as I burst through the door, out of breath and shaking. "You made it back," he said, his voice heavy with something like resignation. "What the hell was that out there?" I demanded, still shaking. "I warned you to stay on the trails," he interrupted softly, avoiding my eyes. "But once they've seen you, there's no going back." I never went camping again after that night. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear my name whispered on the wind. I've always been drawn to the woods. Something about the isolation, the serenity, the quiet calls to me like nothing else. So, When I heard about a camping spot deep in the Appalachian Mountains, far off the beaten path and rarely visited, I couldn't resist. It was the kind of trip I craved, remote, untouched, and full of mystery. I planned everything carefully, packing for a 3-day solo excursion. The trek itself took the better part of a day, and by the time I reached the campsite, the sun was already beginning to sink behind the trees. The forest was dense here, the kind where the canopy is so thick it swallows the sky. It was dark, but I welcomed it. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and settled in for what I thought would be a peaceful night. It wasn't long before I realized something was off. As dusk turned to night, I noticed how deathly quiet the forest had become. No crickets chirping, no distant hoot of an owl. Just silence. It was unnerving, but I chalked it up to the thickness of the forest, muting the sounds of wildlife. I had just convinced myself it was nothing when I heard something faint in the distance. A low, guttural growl. I froze. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. Too deep. Too unnatural. The fire crackled beside me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the tree line. The growl came again, closer this time, vibrating through the ground beneath me. My skin prickled, a cold wave of fear washing over me. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark, but there was nothing. Only trees. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just a bear. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But even then, something felt wrong, like the woods themselves were watching. I didn't sleep much that night, every creak and snap from the forest sending my heart racing. But nothing happened. Not until the second night. I'd spent most of the day hiking, trying to clear my head and shake the paranoia that had settled in my bones. But as the day stretched on, I couldn't help but feel like I was being followed. Every now and then I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow flitting between the trees, gone the moment I turned my head. It was subtle, like whatever it was didn't want to be seen. But it was there. I knew it was there. By the time I returned to my campsite, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the ground. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, almost suffocating. I tried to ignore it, to focus on starting the fire and calming my nerves. But then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods just beyond the reach of my firelight. At first I thought it was a person, a hiker maybe, or a ranger, but something about the way it stood, motionless and hunched, set off alarms in my head. I shone my flashlight toward it, and that's when I saw the eyes, yellow, glowing, and far too large for any human. My breath caught in my throat as the figure stepped closer, revealing more of itself. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its body twisted and elongated, like a man stretched beyond human limits. Its skin was a mottled, sickly gray, and its face was all wrong. It was as if someone had tried to sculpt a human face but got everything just slightly off. Too wide, too sharp. The mouth too wide, and filled with rows of jagged teeth. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The thing didn't move. It just stood there staring at me with those horrible yellow eyes. Its mouth curled into a grin that looked more like a snarl. I don't know how long I stood frozen in fear, but eventually the thing turned and slunk back into the trees, its movements disturbingly smooth and silent, like it was gliding. I wanted to run, to pack up and leave right then and there, but the forest was pitch black, and the thought of running blind through the woods while that thing was out there made my stomach churn. So I stayed by the fire, clutching my flashlight, barely breathing. I didn't sleep at all that night, and that's when I heard them. Voices, faint at first, like a distant conversation carried on the wind. They were coming from deeper in the woods, too far for me to make out the words. But as they grew louder, I realized something horrifying. They were mimicking my voice, my own voice, repeating phrases I had said earlier that day. "This is going to be a great trip," it said, followed by a garbled, distorted laugh. Then another voice joined in, this one raspier, more guttural, repeating another phrase I had spoken. The view from here is unreal. I felt sick. Whatever was out there, it had been watching me, listening to me, and now it was mocking me. The voices circled my camp, growing louder, more frantic. It sounded like there were dozens of them, all talking at once, all using my voice, overlapping and twisting until it was a cacophony of distorted sound. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside my head, reverberating through my skull. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag and bolted, abandoning my tent and gear, running blindly through the woods, the voices following me, laughing, repeating my words over and over. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I saw the faint glow of a lantern through the trees. A ranger's station. Relief flooded through me, and I sprinted toward it, pounding on the door until a man opened it, a park ranger, older, with a weathered face and tired eyes. I stumbled inside, gasping out what had happened. The ranger listened, his expression grim, but he didn't seem surprised. When I finished, he nodded slowly and said, "You're lucky you made it out." "Made it out of what?" I asked, my voice trembling. He sighed and glanced out the window, his eyes scanning the dark tree line. "There are things in these woods, things that aren't natural. They mimic what they hear, take shapes you might recognize. But they're not human and they're not friendly." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. What do they want?" The ranger didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the door and locked it, his face pale as he whispered, "We're not alone." And then from just outside the cabin I heard it again. My voice, "Let me in." It's funny how the wilderness feels peaceful during the day, but when the sun sets it turns into something else entirely. A living, breathing thing that watches you. I didn't believe it at first, not until I started working as a park ranger deep in the northern woods. They always tell you to respect the land, that it's ancient and that some parts of it don't belong to us. I thought it was just folklore to scare rookies like me. But now, after what I've seen, I'm not so sure anymore. My post was about as remote as it gets. 2 hours to the nearest town, no cell service, just an old radio that crackled more than it talked. I'd been assigned to monitor a sector that people rarely hiked through, dense, wild, and crawling with underbrush so thick you could barely see 5 feet ahead at times. But it wasn't just the terrain that kept people away. There were stories, whispers really, of things seen out of the corner of your eye, of voices that weren't quite right. The first few weeks were uneventful. The usual patrols, clearing trails, checking campsites. Most of the time I was alone, just me, the wind, and the rustle of trees. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. It started small, little things I could write off. One evening, I noticed strange tracks outside my cabin. Deep, misshapen footprints, almost human, but with toes too long, spaced too far apart. I brushed it off, assuming it was a bear or some other animal, though it didn't quite sit right. I wasn't an expert, but I knew animal tracks, and they were different. I grabbed my flashlight, scanning the tree line, but the beam only hit darkness and the twisted shapes of trees. The air was still, unnervingly so. That night I barely slept. Every creak, every rustle, I was wide awake, heart pounding. I could feel something outside, something watching. A few nights later, the whispers began. I'd be out on patrol, walking along a trail or sitting in my cabin, and I'd hear my name. Faint, but clear enough to freeze my blood. "Derek," it would call, soft and slow, like a breath against my ear. But whenever I spun around, there was no one, just trees, stretching out like skeletal hands in the dim light. At first I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew better. The forest wasn't silent anymore. It had a pulse, a rhythm I could feel deep in my bones. A week passed and the whispers became more frequent. I would hear them in the middle of the day when the sun was shining, and that terrified me more than anything, because whatever was out there, it didn't care about the light. It wasn't bound by the rules I thought I understood. One night things escalated. I was finishing a late patrol when I saw it. In the distance, maybe 50 yards off, standing between the trees, someone, or something, tall and lanky, its body pale, almost glowing in the moonlight. My first instinct was to call out, thinking it was a lost hiker, but as I raised my hand to wave, it turned its head toward me. Its face, God, I don't even know how to describe it. It wasn't a person. Not anymore. The eyes were too large, too black, and they didn't blink. Its mouth hung open, unnaturally wide, like it was caught mid-scream, though no sound came out. My stomach twisted, bile rising in my throat. I backed away slowly, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. But when it stepped toward me, the branches beneath its feet snapping like brittle bones, I ran. I don't know how I made it back to the cabin, but when I slammed the door shut behind me, I realized I wasn't safe. It was still out there, watching. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see it. I barricaded the door with a chair, not that it would stop whatever that thing was. The radio was dead. No way to call for help. And I was too far from town to hike out in the dark. That night was the longest of my life. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, standing just outside, grinning, waiting. But the worst part, it wasn't alone. There were more of them. I started seeing them during the day, just out of the corner of my eye. A pale face between the trees, a shadow darting across the path, always just out of reach. I couldn't escape them. I was losing my mind. The final straw came a few days later. I woke up to the sound of something scratching at the cabin door. Slow, deliberate, like it was playing with me. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I peeked out the window and my heart stopped. It was me. Standing just a few feet away, wearing my clothes, my face. But its eyes were black, empty voids that stared right into me. It smiled, a grotesque, distorted version of my own face, and whispered my name again. Derek, let me in. I stumbled back, knocking over the chair, and grabbed the axe from under my bed. I wasn't going to let it take me. Whatever it was, it had been watching, waiting for the right moment. And now it was pretending to be me. As I stood there, trembling, axe in hand, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around and froze. It was my partner, Tim. He was supposed to be patrolling the northern trails. But something was off. He looked wrong. His smile too wide. His eyes too dark. "You all right, Derek?" he asked. His voice too calm, too measured. "You've been acting strange." I backed away, my heart racing. That's when I noticed his reflection in the cabin window wasn't there. It wasn't Tim. None of this was real. I don't remember much after that. Just running. Running as far and as fast as I could, away from that thing pretending to be Tim, away from the doppelganger that wore my face. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station at dawn, breathless and broken. They found me wandering the road the next day, muttering to myself, the axe still clutched in my hands. I tried to explain, but no one believed me. They said I'd been alone up there the entire time. No one had come to relieve me. No one had seen Tim in weeks. But I know what I saw, that they're still out there watching, waiting. And next time they'll find someone else to wear. It started as a weekend escape, a way to disconnect from our lives in the city and immerse ourselves in nature. Me, Ryan, Jess, and Kate had planned this camping trip for months, eagerly anticipating the peaceful isolation of Black Hollow Forest. It was remote, quiet, and as we had been told by a few locals, one of the most untouched forests left in the state. We didn't expect much beyond hiking, stargazing, and campfire stories. I wish we had stayed far, far away. We arrived at Black Hollow late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the towering pines. The forest had a stillness to it that was both calming and unsettling. It felt different, like it was watching us. Jess, the most experienced camper, found a perfect spot near a clearing, and we set up our tents. The evening crept in fast, the warmth of the fire a small comfort, as shadows lengthened across the trees. "Did you hear that?" Kate asked after a while, breaking the comfortable silence. She had a habit of being a little jumpy, but her voice had an edge of real concern. We all stopped and listened. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. No usual night sounds, no crickets, no owls, just an eerie silence stretching on like the calm before a storm. "Probably nothing," Ryan shrugged, tossing another log on the fire. The crackle of the flames was the only thing keeping the oppressive quiet at bay. But then I heard it too. A distant sound, faint at first, like the wind carrying a voice, calling. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a cry for help. Jess stood up, squinting into the dark woods. "Someone's out there." None of us moved for a moment. We all just stared into the forest, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. Then Ryan grabbed a flashlight. "We should go see if someone's lost." I didn't want to leave the fire. That sense of being watched only grew stronger, more oppressive, like the forest itself was pressing in around us. But Ryan was already heading into the trees, and Jess followed close behind. "Stay here with Kate," Jess said over her shoulder. "We won't go far." Kate and I sat in tense silence, listening as Ryan and Jess's footsteps faded into the woods. The light from their flashlight danced among the trees, then disappeared completely, swallowed by the night. A minute passed, then 5, then 10. I couldn't stand the waiting anymore. "I'm going after them," I said, standing up and grabbing my own flashlight. "Stay here by the fire." Kate just nodded, her eyes wide with fear, clutching her knees as though that would keep her safe. I didn't want to leave her, but the silence that followed Ryan and Jess's departure gnawed at me. I stepped into the woods, calling their names. The trees were dense, the flashlight's beam barely cutting through the darkness. My breath was loud in the still air, the only sound aside from my feet crunching on dead leaves. "Ryan? Jess?" I called out, but there was no answer. Just that heavy, unnatural silence. I don't know how far I walked before I saw it, a light flickering up ahead. My heart leaped. They must have found someone, I thought. But as I got closer, I realized the light was wrong. It wasn't a flashlight, but a lantern, a soft yellow glow swaying gently in the air. And beneath it stood a man. He wore a park ranger uniform, his broad-brimmed hat shadowing his face. The strangest thing, though, was how still he was. Not a twitch or a shift in weight. Just standing there, watching. I felt an icy shiver run down my spine. "Are you looking for someone?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The ranger didn't respond at first, and when he finally did, his voice sounded strange, like it was coming from somewhere deep in his throat, as if he hadn't spoken in years. "You shouldn't be out here." "I'm with my friends," I said. "They went into the woods and "You need to leave," he interrupted, his head tilting ever so slightly. "This forest, it belongs to them." My skin prickled with dread. "Them? Who are you talking about?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his lantern casting strange, shifting shadows across his face. I took a step back instinctively, and that's when I saw it, the way his legs bent at an unnatural angle, as if his joints weren't quite right. A horrible realization hit me all at once. This thing was not human. I turned and ran. The forest felt different now, twisted. The trees were closer together, the path more narrow. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I stumbled, desperate to get back to the fire, back to Kate. When I burst into the clearing, panting and wild-eyed, I found Kate standing by the fire. But she wasn't alone. Standing beside her, holding a lantern, was the ranger. "Kate, get away from him," I shouted, but Kate just stared at me, her face pale and expressionless. Then, with a sickening crack, the ranger's head turned toward me, far too far to the side, an inhuman twist. And from his mouth came a low, rumbling growl, followed by words that froze the blood in my veins. "They're already mine." Before I could react, the thing that looked like a ranger lunged, its body contorting, shifting. For just a second, its form flickered, its human skin melting away to reveal something far worse. A twisted, elongated creature, with hollow eyes and skin stretched too tight over bone. A skinwalker. I backed away, my legs shaking, but Kate didn't move. She stood there, unblinking, her eyes dull. "Kate," I whispered. And that's when I noticed the subtle twitch beneath her skin, the too still way she was standing. I had been wrong. Kate wasn't safe at the campfire. She wasn't Kate at all. The fire crackled behind them, casting long, jagged shadows as they stepped forward, their bodies shifting and breaking into unnatural shapes. I realized, with a heart-stopping certainty, that whatever had taken them wasn't planning on letting me leave either. The forest belonged to them now, and soon I would too. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, a peaceful break from the chaos of our city lives. Me, Mark, Sarah, and Tyler had been talking for weeks about getting away, escaping to the remote solitude of Deer Haven Forest. None of us had been there before, but that was part of the appeal, an untouched expanse of wilderness, miles away from any town or even cell service. We arrived just before dusk, parking the car at the edge of a narrow dirt path that wound deeper into the woods. The forest stretched out before us, dense and foreboding, but beautiful. The tall pine trees seemed to go on forever, their tops swaying gently in the breeze. There was a strange stillness to the air, but we didn't think much of it. This was exactly what we had come for, after all. Quiet isolation. As we hiked in, setting up camp a few miles into the forest, the sun began to sink low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. Sarah, always the most practical one, had insisted we get a fire going early. By the time the stars were twinkling above us, we were settled in, enjoying the warmth of the flames and the cool night air. "Did you hear that?" Tyler asked suddenly, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. His head was tilted slightly, like he was trying to catch something just out of earshot. We all paused, listening. There it was, faint, almost too quiet to notice, a soft, melodic whistling drifting through the trees. It didn't sound like birds or wind, more like someone whistling a tune. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to brush it off. This forest was supposed to be empty. No one else was supposed to be out here. "It's probably just the wind," Sarah said, though her voice was a little tight. Mark chuckled, tossing another log into the fire. "Yeah, or Bigfoot practicing his scales. Relax. We're in the middle of nowhere." But as the night wore on, the whistling didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder, clearer. It seemed to move, sometimes coming from deeper in the woods, sometimes from closer, as if circling us. We all noticed it, but no one wanted to admit that it was starting to unnerve us. We distracted ourselves with jokes and ghost stories, though I could tell the others were growing more uneasy with each passing minute. Finally, I stood up. "I'm going to check it out. Probably some animal or something. I'll be back in a minute." "Be careful," Sarah warned, though she tried to sound casual. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped away from the fire, walking toward the trees where the whistling seemed to come from. The moment I left the circle of light, the forest felt different. The darkness was thick, oppressive, and the sound of my own footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. The whistling was clearer now, like it was just ahead of me. I followed the sound deeper into the woods, weaving between the trees, shining my flashlight around, but I saw nothing. No animals, no people, just the trees and the darkness. But that whistling, it didn't stop, and worse, it began to change. At first it was a simple, repetitive tune, like someone mindlessly whistling a song they couldn't quite remember. But now it was discordant, irregular, almost mocking. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as the sound seemed to move all around me, like whoever or whatever was whistling was circling me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding weak in the vast empty woods. "Is someone out there?" No answer, just more whistling. Only now it was closer. I took a step back, heart pounding in my chest, and turned to head back to camp. That's when I saw it, just for a moment in the beam of my flashlight, a figure standing between the trees, maybe 20 feet away. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs too long for its body. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel it staring at me, even from that distance. And then it whistled. My breath caught in my throat as the figure stepped closer, slow and deliberate. The whistling never stopped, but the tune became distorted, garbled, like it wasn't coming from human lips. I didn't wait any longer. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, my flashlight bouncing wildly in the dark. I could hear the whistling behind me, growing louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. The trees seemed to close in around me, the forest an endless maze of shadows and branches. Finally, I burst back into the clearing where we had set up camp. I was breathless, my heart hammering in my chest. But when I reached the fire, everything looked wrong. Mark, Sarah, and Tyler were still sitting by the fire, but they were motionless. Too still. The flames crackled in front of them, but they didn't react. Didn't even seem to notice I had returned. A cold dread settled over me as I approached them. "Guys?" I whispered, stepping closer. No response. I reached out to shake Sarah's shoulder, and the moment I touched her, her body slumped forward. Limp. Like a puppet with its strings cut. I stumbled back in horror, my flashlight dropping to the ground, the beam flickering out. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stared at their lifeless bodies, still sitting upright, their faces slack, eyes empty. And then, the whistling started again, right behind me. I spun around, my heart stopping as I saw it, standing at the edge of the firelight, the figure from the woods. Its face was no longer hidden. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and its mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin, wider than any human's could be from ear to ear. Its lips puckered as it whistled that same twisted tune. My legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place as the thing stepped forward, its long limbs bending unnaturally, its grin widening impossibly. It tilted its head almost playfully as it reached out toward me with long skeletal fingers. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the sound of that horrible, mocking whistle. When I woke up, I was alone. The fire was cold, the tents were gone, and my friends, Mark, Sarah, Tyler, were nowhere to be found. There was no trace of them, no sign that anyone had ever been here at all. Except for the whistling, it never stops. I should have listened to the warnings. I should have never gone into the hollow woods alone. Everyone in town said it was cursed, but I thought they were just being superstitious. A place like that? Untouched for centuries, they said. People went in, but not many came out. The ones who did were never the same. It seemed like a challenge to me. I was the new guy in town, the outsider, and I had always loved exploring remote places. I told myself I wasn't afraid of ghost stories. I was smarter than that. I could handle it. Now, sitting here writing this by the dim glow of my flashlight, I realize I was wrong. Horribly, terrifyingly wrong. I went in yesterday morning planning to spend just one night. My pack was loaded with gear, enough food, water, and supplies to last me twice as long, just in case. The trail leading into the hollow woods was overgrown, barely visible in places. The trees were thick, their branches twisted together like they were trying to keep something out, or in. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the sound of my boots crunching on dead leaves and twigs. It was eerie, sure, but not enough to turn me back. I set up camp just before sunset, by a small stream that cut through the dense forest. The place had an ancient feel, like it hadn't been touched by time or people in centuries. The trees loomed overhead, their bark dark and slick, covered in moss and strange, spidery patterns that didn't look quite natural. I shrugged it off, telling myself I'd seen worse, but as the last light of day faded and darkness settled over the forest, the sense of unease grew. It started with the wind, except it wasn't really wind. It was more like a low, constant murmur that seemed to come from all directions at once. At first I thought it was just the trees shifting in the breeze. But then I realized there was no breeze. The air was still heavy. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. The woods felt alive. Not in the normal way forests do, with the rustling of animals and the calls of birds, but something deeper, like the ground itself was breathing, pulsing with an unseen force. I told myself it was just nerves. The stories had gotten under my skin, that's all. Then I heard it, a soft rustling just beyond the edge of the firelight. I looked up, my heart thudding in my chest, but saw nothing. Just the dark shapes of trees, their branches swaying slightly in the... What? There was no wind. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and shone it into the trees. The beam flickered slightly as I swept it across the undergrowth, casting long, dancing shadows. Nothing. I sat back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stared into the darkness, straining to hear anything besides the crackling of the fire and that low, unsettling murmur. Then the whispering started. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, like the sound of the wind brushing through the leaves. But it grew louder, more distinct, until I could almost make out words. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stood again, shining my light into the trees, my pulse quickening. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding too loud in the oppressive quiet. "Is anyone there?" No answer, just that whispering. It almost sounded like my name. I turned in a slow circle, shining my flashlight all around the campsite. The forest loomed, dark and thick but empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just outside the light's reach, watching me. Then just as quickly as it started, the whispering stopped. Silence. I sat down, trying to calm my racing heart. The fire crackled softly, the flames dancing, but the oppressive feeling of being watched didn't go away. And then from behind me I heard it. A laugh, quiet, almost like a child's giggle, but it was wrong. Distorted, twisted. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the dark, landing on nothing. My breath came in shallow, panicked bursts. I wasn't alone. I knew that now. I grabbed my knife, holding it in one hand while I scanned the trees, my eyes wide, heart hammering in my chest. The woods were too quiet, and the shadows seemed to be moving, shifting just out of sight. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the firelight. Just far enough that I could barely make it out. A tall, impossibly thin shape, too tall to be a person. Its arms were long, dangling down almost to the ground, its head cocked to one side like it was studying me. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw its face. Pale, hollow, with eyes that were nothing but black pits. I blinked, and it was gone. I stumbled back, falling to the ground, my flashlight rolling away from me. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and the whispering started again, louder this time. Closer. The shadows around me seemed to twist and writhe like they were alive. I grabbed the flashlight, my hands trembling, and shone it into the trees again. There was nothing there, but I knew. Something was watching me. I could feel it, could feel its eyes on me, hear its breath in the rustling leaves. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, watching the darkness, waiting for something to move, to step into the light. The whispering never stopped, and neither did the feeling that I was being watched. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up and started hiking out of the valley, but the trail was wrong. The trees weren't where they should be. Landmarks I had passed on the way in were gone. It was like the forest had shifted overnight, like it was deliberately trying to keep me there. And the worst part? The whispering followed me. Even now, as I write this, sitting in what should be the safety of daylight, I can hear it, just beneath the sound of the wind, just beyond the edge of my hearing. It's getting closer. I don't know if I'll make it out. But if you're reading this, if anyone is reading this, don't go into the hollow woods. Don't listen to the whispers. And whatever you do, don't look behind you. because once you hear them, they never stop. I've been camping all my life. There's nothing like the peace of the deep woods, the stillness that settles over the trees when the sun dips below the horizon, and the crackle of the fire cutting through the cold night air. But this last trip, this one changed everything. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. My best friend Matt and I had been planning it for weeks. We both needed a break from our jobs, our lives, and the constant buzz of the city. We picked a secluded spot deep in the Appalachian woods, miles from the nearest town. A place where we could just disconnect. The first day was perfect. We hiked for hours, set up our tent near a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, and cracked open a couple of beers as the fire crackled beneath a brilliant sky. It was peaceful, serene even. But as the night crept in, that stillness I loved so much began to feel heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. It started with the sounds. At first, I brushed it off as the usual forest noises, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. You hear that kind of stuff all the time out there. But this was different. The sounds weren't random, like animals scurrying in the underbrush. They were rhythmic, almost deliberate. Matt noticed it too. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice low. "Probably just deer or something," I replied, trying to convince myself more than him. But deep down, I knew something was off. The sounds continued, getting closer. There was a weird cadence to it, like footsteps, slow, purposeful steps that stopped the moment we stopped talking. Every time we shined our flashlights into the woods, we saw nothing but trees, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. By midnight, the noises had stopped, leaving the woods in an unnatural silence. No crickets, no wind, just the crackling of the fire. Matt, trying to lighten the mood, joked about Bigfoot, but neither of us laughed. We turned in for the night, but sleep didn't come easy. The air inside the tent felt suffocating, and every time I closed my eyes, I felt that same sensation, that we were being watched. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of Matt unzipping the tent. "What are you doing?" I mumbled, still half asleep. "Just gotta take a leak," he whispered back, his silhouette outlined by the faint glow of the moon. I heard him step outside and figured I'd try to go back to sleep. But minutes passed, and he didn't return. I sat up, listening. The forest was still eerily quiet, but I could hear faint noises, twigs snapping, the same deliberate footsteps from before. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cold night air. "Matt?" I called, shining the beam around the clearing. Nothing. My heart started pounding in my chest. The fire had died down to embers, casting long, eerie shadows around the camp. That's when I saw him. Matt stood at the edge of the clearing just beyond the reach of the dying firelight. His back was to me, shoulders stiff and hunched, staring into the woods. "Hey man, you good?" I asked, stepping closer. He didn't move. Something about the way he was standing sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't right. His posture was wrong. Like he was too rigid, too stiff. I stopped a few feet away, my breath clouding in the cold air. "Matt," I whispered. Slowly, he turned around. But it wasn't Matt. Not really. His face, it looked like him, sure, but the eyes were wrong. They were too wide, too dark. His mouth twitched like he was trying to smile but didn't quite know how. It was like someone was wearing his skin, pretending to be him, but didn't know how to act human. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then, without a word, he, or it, turned and walked back into the woods. Not hurriedly, just slow, deliberate steps, like it knew I was too terrified to follow. I didn't. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the spot where it disappeared. My body felt like it had been drained of all warmth, all strength. Finally, I forced myself to move, stumbling back to the tent. I didn't sleep, I just sat there clutching the flashlight, waiting for morning. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I ventured out, calling Matt's name over and over. There was no answer, no sign of him. It was like he had vanished. I spent hours searching the woods, but it was useless. The strange thing was, the deeper I went into the forest, the more I found signs of movement. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, but no Matt. Just tracks, and not just his. The footprints were wrong, too large, too misshapen. They were human-like, but distorted, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them didn't quite know how feet were supposed to work. I was ready to head back to camp, to pack up and hike out when I heard it. Matt's voice. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but it was him, calling my name. Relief washed over me, and I ran toward the sound. But as I got closer, that feeling of wrongness returned, stronger than ever. His voice was coming from deeper in the woods, much deeper than he could have gone in the time he'd been missing, and there was something off about the tone. It was too calm, too steady. I stopped in my tracks. That's when I noticed something else. The forest was completely silent again. No birds, no insects, nothing. "Come on, man," the voice called again. "I'm over here." I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the car, legs burning, chest heaving. I didn't look back. I just drove. Fast. It's been weeks since that night, and Matt still hasn't been found. Search parties turned up, nothing. No trace of him. It's like he vanished into thin air. But sometimes late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I hear it. His voice, calling my name from just outside my window, but it's not him, and I know better than to answer. I've been camping all my life. I love the isolation, the crisp air, the sense of detachment from the world. You set up camp, share a few beers around the fire, and let the night's peaceful stillness wash over you. But this time, it was different. It was a cool October weekend, and my friends and I had decided to hike deep into Pine Ridge Forest. It's remote, sure, but that's what we loved about it. Untouched, serene. The only access road was long and winding, and we hadn't seen another car for miles. We arrived at our campsite just before sunset. The tall pines loomed above us, their silhouettes against the fading light making the forest feel ancient, like it had been here long before any of us. After setting up our tents, we started a fire, cracking jokes and passing around a flask. Typical stuff. But as the sky turned a deep indigo, something felt off. It started with the sounds, low, distant howls carried on the wind. Not wolves, not coyotes, something else. Something I couldn't quite place. The others didn't seem to notice at first, but I did. And once I pointed it out, everyone fell quiet, listening. There it was again, closer this time. A deep guttural groan like an animal in pain. But there was something unnatural about it. My friend Dave brushed it off, claiming it was just the wind, but I could see the unease in his eyes. We tried to ignore it, laughing nervously and turning our focus back to the fire. That's when we saw him, the park ranger. He stood just at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the flickering light of the fire. Tall, broad shoulders, his ranger hat low over his face. There hadn't been a ranger station anywhere near the trail, but we assumed he was just out on patrol. "Hey there," Dave called out. "You need something?" The ranger didn't respond. He just stood there motionless, staring. At least, I think he was staring. The shadow cast by his hat made it hard to tell. We waited, but still nothing. The fire crackled and popped, and the silence between us grew thicker, heavier. My pulse quickened, a primal instinct kicking in, telling me something wasn't right. After what felt like an eternity, the ranger finally moved. Slowly, deliberately. He stepped back into the darkness, vanishing into the trees without a word. My friends laughed it off again, trying to break the tension, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The howls came back, louder now, and they seemed to echo from all around us. It wasn't just one sound anymore. It was several. They moved unnervingly fast through the woods, sometimes too far away to pinpoint, other times so close it felt like they were just beyond the tree line. The firelight flickered wildly, casting twisted shadows that danced and slithered across the ground. That's when we saw it again, the ranger. This time he was closer, just beyond the edge of the fire's glow. But something was different. His hat was gone. His head tilted unnaturally to the side, like he was trying to look at us from an angle that no human should be able to achieve. And then, the smell hit us. The stench of rotting meat, thick and sour. It was overwhelming, and I felt my stomach churn. I glanced at my friends. Their faces were pale, eyes wide. This wasn't a game anymore. "Let's get inside the tents," I whispered, but no one moved. The ranger, or whatever it was, took another step forward, and I saw it. His legs. They weren't right. They bent backward like a deer's. I could barely breathe as the realization hit me. This wasn't a man. It wasn't a ranger. Suddenly, Dave stood up. "Hey, what the hell do you want?" His voice shook, but he tried to sound brave. The thing paused, its head snapping back in a grotesque motion, like it had just noticed him for the first time. Slowly it lifted a hand, a long, distorted hand that stretched into claws, and pointed. It was pointing at Dave. Without warning, the howls returned, deafening this time, filling the forest with a cacophony of screams. And then the thing smiled. It smiled in a way that no human could ever smile, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth. That's when we ran. We sprinted through the woods, not caring about our tents or gear, just trying to put as much distance between us and that thing as possible. The howls followed us, snapping branches, the rustle of leaves getting closer, faster. My lungs burned, my legs screamed with exhaustion, but I didn't stop. We stumbled upon an old abandoned ranger station, a relic from decades ago. It was barely standing, but it was shelter. We barricaded ourselves inside, hearts pounding, breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by our desperate attempts to calm down. And then from outside, the familiar voice. "Hey, you guys okay in there?" It was Dave's voice. But Dave was right next to me. The blood drained from my face. My other friends stared at the door, trembling, wide-eyed. The voice came again, perfectly mimicking Dave's tone, his cadence. "Guys, come on, let me in." No one moved. We sat in stunned silence, paralyzed by fear. The voice outside turned sinister. "Come on, I just want to talk." It wasn't Dave. It wasn't anything human. The thing outside continued to taunt us, its voice shifting, becoming distorted, like a radio stuck between stations. I don't know how long we sat there waiting for it to leave. Hours, maybe. Eventually the forest grew quiet again. No more howls, no more footsteps. Just the dead silence of the night. But here's the part that still haunts me, the part that keeps me awake at night. When we finally built up the courage to leave that rotting ranger station and make our way back to the car, we found something just outside the door. A park ranger's hat, perfectly placed in the dirt, and Dave's voice, laughing softly from the shadows. I've been a park ranger for nearly 7 years, stationed in the dense heart of the Pacific Northwest. The forest here is ancient, full of towering trees, some older than time itself. It's a beautiful, serene place during the day, silent except for the gentle rustle of the wind through the pines and the distant calls of wildlife. At night, though, the woods take on a different character. You begin to notice things that don't make sense. I used to dismiss them, brush off the strange sensations as tricks of the mind. But not anymore. It was late October when things started happening. I was assigned to a solo patrol out near Black Hollow, a section of the forest known for its jagged cliffs and tangled undergrowth. Not many campers venture out there, too remote, too easy to get lost. Still, the occasional thrill seeker or backcountry hiker would make the trek, and it was my job to make sure they stayed safe. I set out just before dusk, my truck bouncing over the uneven trail. The sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the ground. The further I drove, the more oppressive the forest felt, as if it were closing in around me. Eventually, the road became impassable, and I parked near a clearing, deciding to hike the rest of the way to a fire lookout about 2 miles deeper into the woods. As I hiked, the temperature began to drop and the usual sounds of the forest, birdsong, rustling leaves, faded into an eerie silence. That's when I first noticed it, the feeling of being watched. I've spent countless nights alone in the woods, but this was different. This wasn't the vague paranoia of isolation. This was something specific, targeted. I stopped scanning the trees, half expecting to see a cougar or a bear, but there was nothing, just the stillness. I shook it off and pressed on. About an hour into the hike, I reached a narrow creek, the water trickling quietly over the rocks. That's when I saw the first sign something was wrong. Across the creek, maybe 20 feet away, stood a deer. At least I thought it was a deer. Its body was wrong, legs too long, unnaturally thin. Its head was lowered as if grazing, but its eyes were fixed on me. I stood frozen, staring back at it. Something about the creature made my skin crawl. Slowly, without turning its head, it began to back away, retreating into the trees. And just like that, it was gone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I was already too far in, too committed. I pushed forward, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe the shadows had distorted its shape. I told myself 1,000 lies, but deep down I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. As I neared the lookout, the wind began to pick up, howling through the trees in mournful gusts. The structure stood atop a rocky outcrop, offering a panoramic view of the forest below. I climbed the creaky ladder to the top, trying to shake the unease that had settled deep in my gut. Once inside, I checked the radio, but there was no signal. Figures. These old towers were notoriously unreliable. The sun had fully set by now, and darkness swallowed the landscape. I turned on my flashlight, scanning the tree line below. Everything looked still, normal. But that feeling, the one that had followed me since the creek, had only grown stronger. It was as if the woods themselves were alive, watching, waiting for something. Suddenly a movement caught my eye. I focused the beam of my flashlight on the ground below the tower. At first I thought it was just a deer again, but this time there was no mistaking it. A figure was standing there just outside the reach of the light, human-like but not human. Its limbs were elongated, its posture hunched, and its skin, pale, stretched tight over 2 thin bones. I blinked, convinced I was seeing things, but it didn't move. It just stood there, staring up at me. My heart pounded in my chest. I swallowed hard, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was some kind of animal, maybe. But no, I knew what I was looking at. This was no animal. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I grabbed the radio again, but the static was louder now, almost deafening. I turned it off, feeling a rising sense of panic. I needed to leave. Now. I bolted down the ladder, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The figure was gone, but the forest felt wrong. The trees seemed to pulse, the shadows shifting unnaturally. I sprinted back the way I'd come, my footsteps echoing in the eerie stillness. Then I heard it, a low guttural growl close behind me. I didn't dare look back. I ran, faster than I'd ever run before, the cold air burning in my lungs. But no matter how fast I went, the growling grew louder, closer, until I could feel its breath on the back of my neck. Finally, I broke through the tree line, stumbling into the clearing where I'd left my truck. I fumbled with the keys, barely able to breathe, before finally getting the door open. I jumped inside, slamming it shut and locking the doors. The forest was deathly quiet again. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white. Slowly, I dared to glance in the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind me, just the trees, swaying gently in the wind. I let out a shaky breath and started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced back at the lookout one last time, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing on the roof of the tower, watching me. It was the same figure from before, pale and thin, but this time it was smiling. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I floored it, not daring to look back again. To this day, I don't know what I saw out there in Black Hollow, but I haven't been back since. I filled my report, left out the details, and transferred to another post far from those woods. I can still feel them watching sometimes, though, late at night. I'll be sitting in my cabin, alone, and the wind will start to howl. And I'll know they're out there waiting. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. The idea was simple. Head out to the most remote spot I could find, spend a couple of nights under the stars, and disconnect from the world. I found a place on an old, barely maintained trail deep in the mountains, a place almost no one knew about. The reviews I'd found in obscure online forums mentioned its beauty, its isolation, and most intriguingly, how people often felt like they weren't alone out there, despite the utter remoteness. I shrugged that part off, though. People tend to get spooked when they're alone in the wilderness. I craved that feeling, a chance to be totally disconnected, alone with my thoughts. After hours of driving and another 2 hours of hiking, I found the spot. It was beautiful, just like I'd imagined. A small clearing surrounded by dense trees, with a cliff edge not far off that overlooked the valley below. The forest seemed endless, stretching out in every direction. And I was the only person for miles. Perfect. I set up camp, got a fire going, and settled in for the evening. As the sun set, I sat by the fire, enjoying the silence. The only sounds were the crackling of the flames and the occasional breeze rustling the leaves. It was peaceful. Exactly what I needed. Around midnight, as the fire was dying down, I heard it. A voice. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Help. I sat up, suddenly alert. It wasn't a scream, not a desperate cry, but a soft, almost pleading voice. I strained my ears, listening, but the woods had gone quiet again, just the fire crackling. I shook my head. My imagination was getting the best of me, but then there it was again. Help me, please. This time the voice was clearer, closer. My blood turned cold. It was a woman's voice, soft but filled with something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, sweeping the beam across the trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. "Is someone out there?" No answer. I stood there for a minute, flashlight in hand, listening. Nothing. Just the wind now, gently pushing through the branches. Maybe I'd misheard, or maybe the wind was playing tricks on me. I sat back down, telling myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my gut. I was just about to crawl into my tent when I heard it again. "Please, help me." This time it sounded like it was coming from the direction of the cliff, just beyond the trees. My heart pounded, but I couldn't ignore it now. What if someone really was out there, hurt or lost? I grabbed my flashlight again and headed toward the sound. The beam of my light cut through the darkness as I walked toward the cliff, the ground beneath my feet soft with pine needles. The forest felt different now, like it was watching me. The trees seemed to close in around me the further I went. I reached the edge of the cliff and stopped, shining my light out over the valley. The drop was steep, jagged rocks far below. Nothing moved. The forest was utterly still. "Hello?" I called again, my voice shaky. No response. I stood there, scanning the area with my light. Nothing. Just the trees, the cliff, and the empty valley below. I was about to turn back when I heard something new. A faint rustling sound behind me. I whipped around, shining the flashlight back toward the trees. At first, I saw nothing. Just the dark shapes of the forest. But then I saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the tree line. It was barely visible, like a shadow. Tall, thin, its limbs too long, its posture strange, unnatural. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking. "Who's there?" The figure didn't move, it just stood there watching me. My heart was hammering in my chest now. The voice had come from the cliff, but this figure, had been behind me the whole time. I took a step back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. And that's when the figure started to move. Not toward me, no, it moved away, back into the trees, slipping silently into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. My instincts screamed at me to get the hell out of there, but something else, a morbid curiosity maybe, held me in place. That's when I heard the voice again. "Help me, please." But this time it wasn't distant. It was right behind me. I spun around, pointing the flashlight toward the cliff. But there was no one there. Just the drop, the endless valley below, and the oppressive, suffocating darkness of the forest. I ran back to my camp, my chest tight, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stumbled into my tent, zipped it up, and sat there in the dark, clutching the flashlight like it was the only thing keeping me alive. I didn't sleep. I sat there for hours, waiting, listening. But the voice didn't come again, and neither did the figure. When the first light of dawn broke, I packed up as fast as I could. I didn't care about breakfast or taking my time. I just needed to get out of there. The hike back felt like a blur, and the entire time I felt like I was being watched, like something was following me just beyond the edge of the trail. I didn't see anyone or hear anything strange again, but that didn't stop the feeling of dread that followed me all the way to my truck. I've been back home for a few days now, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I imagined the voice, the figure in the trees. But last night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. "Help me. Please." And somehow I know it followed me back. The strange thing is, I can't stop thinking about the cliff, about how the voice came from there, about the figure watching me from the trees. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I wonder if it was calling me, or warning me. And now, late at night, when the world is quiet, I feel it. It's waiting. I always loved camping. The solitude, the way the air smells like pine and damp earth, and the peace that comes from being so far from civilization. This year, I decided to go alone. A solo trip into the dense woods, remote, deep enough into the forest that I wouldn't hear or see anyone else for days. It was supposed to be peaceful. The hike to the spot I picked was long, almost 5 hours from where I parked my car, the trees growing thicker the farther I went. The light struggled to penetrate the canopy, making the forest floor feel dim even in the middle of the day. I liked it. It felt like I had crossed some invisible threshold, leaving the world behind. I set up camp by a small clearing with a narrow stream cutting through the underbrush nearby. The water made this soft, constant burble that was almost hypnotic. Perfect white noise. After getting everything ready, tent pitched, firewood gathered, food prepared, I settled in for the evening, watching the sun slowly dip behind the trees. It got dark fast. Really dark. I'm used to the night in the woods, but this was different. It was thick, like the shadows clung to the trees, stretching and growing, swallowing up the little light left. The fire crackled, casting flickering shapes that danced around the edge of the clearing. It felt like something was watching me from the tree line, just beyond the fire's reach. It was the first time I felt uneasy. I brushed it off. I mean, it's easy to get spooked out here, alone with just your thoughts and the wilderness. So, I sat close to the fire and stared into the flames, trying to let it calm me down. Eventually I fell asleep, the cold creeping in as the fire died out. Then came the first night. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, soft, crunching footsteps like something or someone was walking around my tent. I stayed perfectly still, my breath shallow, straining to hear. The footsteps would move, pause, and then shuffle again. It circled the tent, slow and deliberate. It's just an animal, I told myself, probably a deer or a raccoon. But then I heard it. A whisper. At first it was so faint I wasn't sure I heard it. But there it was again. A soft, almost unintelligible murmur, like someone whispering right next to the fabric of the tent. My heart pounded. I forced myself to unzip the tent, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I scanned the area. Nothing. No one. The woods were still. No footsteps, no voices, just the faint hum of insects in the distance. I laughed nervously, convincing myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. But the unease stuck with me. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I spent hours hiking, exploring, trying to enjoy the isolation I came here for. But something was off. No matter where I went, it felt like the forest was watching me. The trees stood too still, the wind too silent, and then I noticed something strange. The temperature was dropping. It was subtle at first, a chill in the air that didn't belong in the middle of summer. As the day went on, the drop became more noticeable. By late afternoon, I could see my breath fogging in front of me. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and despite the layers of clothes, I couldn't shake the cold. When I returned to camp, there was frost on the grass, clinging to the leaves like it was the dead of winter. That night it got worse. I woke up again, but this time it wasn't footsteps that roused me. It was voices. Clear, distinct voices, more than one, whispering just outside my tent. They weren't speaking in a language I recognized, more like the low murmur of something ancient, something wrong. I grabbed my flashlight, holding it tight, but I didn't open the tent. I couldn't. The whispers grew louder, moving around me just like the footsteps the night before. And then, from one side of the tent, I heard something press against the fabric. Just for a second, a light touch that sent a jolt of terror through me. I couldn't stay there. I didn't care if it was an animal or a trick of the wind or even my own mind. I was done. I packed up in the dark, fumbling with my gear, trying not to look too hard into the trees. It felt like something was waiting out there, just beyond the firelight. When I finally started hiking out, it was almost dawn, but the forest seemed darker than ever. The path looked different, twisted, like the trees had moved overnight. The cold clung to me, and the whispers, God, those whispers, they followed me, always just out of reach. Then I saw the footprints. At first they were scattered, hard to make out, but as I walked, they became more clear. They weren't mine. They were larger, deeper, and there were dozens of them, all around me. Some looked fresh, others older, like they had been there long before I arrived. The worst part, they weren't just on the ground. Some of the prints went up the sides of trees like something had crawled up the bark, dragging itself higher into the canopy. I quickened my pace, practically running now, desperate to get out of the woods, to see the road, my car, anything that wasn't this endless, oppressive forest. Finally I saw it, the edge of the woods, the clearing where I parked my car. But something was wrong. The car, it was covered in frost, thick white frost like it had been sitting there for weeks, untouched. My breath hitched in my throat as I reached for the door, but the metal was icy, freezing to the touch. As I tried to open it, I saw something in the corner of my eye. A reflection. In the window there was a face, not mine, not anyone I'd ever seen. Pale, twisted, hollow-eyed, it stared back at me from the inside of the car, and behind it, the forest, the trees, those endless whispering trees. I never made it out of the woods, not really, because every time I try to leave I end up back here. The same clearing, the same frost, the same face in the window. The forest doesn't let you go, it just keeps you watching, waiting until you're part of it too. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away from everything, a chance to clear my head and get some peace. I'd heard about a place, a hidden spot off the main trails deep in Black Pine Forest. Not many people went there, which was exactly why I chose it. I wanted to be alone, just me in the wilderness. That's the kind of escape I needed. The drive took longer than I expected, winding down forgotten roads that seemed to get narrower the further I went. By the time I parked my car at the trailhead, it was already late afternoon. I grabbed my pack, checked my map, and started the hike to the campsite. The trail was overgrown and barely visible, but I didn't mind. That was part of the adventure. After about 2 hours, I found a small clearing beside a river, the kind of spot that felt untouched by time. The trees here were taller, their trunks thick and dark, and their branches twisted together in a tangled canopy overhead. The light that filtered through was dim, even though the sun was still up. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and settled in for the evening. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the shadows grew long, and the forest around me seemed to deepen, becoming almost unnervingly quiet. But I was used to being alone in the woods. A little quiet never bothered me. Or so I thought. After dinner, I sat by the fire, listening to the crackle of the flames and the gentle rush of the river nearby. For a while, it was peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. But as the night grew darker, that strange, creeping sensation of being watched began to creep in. I couldn't explain it. It was like the forest had suddenly gotten heavier, like the trees themselves were pressing in on me. I told myself it was just the solitude, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I looked out into the darkness beyond the firelight, I felt like something was there. Just beyond where the light faded into the thick woods, I swore I saw movement. A shadow maybe, something that wasn't quite right. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing. Just the tangled mess of branches and the thick underbrush. I tried to laugh it off, shaking my head at how easily I was spooking myself. I'd spent plenty of nights alone in the woods before. This was no different, except it was. The fire burned low, and I decided to call it a night. I banked the flames, crawled into my tent, and zipped it up tight. Lying there, cocooned in my sleeping bag, I listened to the stillness. It was unnerving, too quiet. No wind, no insects, no rustling of leaves. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to grow thicker as the night wore on. I don't know how long I lay there before I heard it, the sound of something moving outside my tent. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but then I realized it wasn't moving like an animal. It was slow, deliberate. Heavy footsteps, crunching softly in the dirt and leaves. Whatever it was walking around the perimeter of my campsite just outside my tent. I froze, holding my breath, listening as the footsteps circled closer and closer. I didn't dare move. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it almost deafening in the quiet. The footsteps stopped directly beside my tent, just inches from where I lay. I could hear the soft rustling of fabric as something, or someone, brushed against the nylon. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly in my shaking hand, and slowly turned it on, aiming it toward the tent wall. The light illuminated the inside of the tent, casting strange shadows on the walls, but I couldn't see anything outside. And then I heard breathing. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Slow, steady breaths, just outside the tent, as if someone was standing there, watching me. My mouth went dry, my body rigid with fear. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. For what felt like hours, I lay there, frozen, listening to that slow, rhythmic breathing. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. I waited, my heart still pounding in my ears, but the footsteps didn't return. Slowly, I worked up the courage to unzip the tent just a little, shining my flashlight out into the darkness. Nothing. The campsite was empty. I sat up, my body trembling with adrenaline. I listened for any sound, any hint of movement, but the forest was silent again. Whatever or whoever had been out there was gone. At least that's what I told myself. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed up camp in a hurry, stuffing my gear into my pack and dousing the fire. I didn't care about breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The uneasy feeling of being watched had never left me, and I was sure as I hiked back to the trailhead that something was following me. Every now and then I would stop, turn, and listen. I never saw anything, but the forest felt different. The shadows were darker, the trees more twisted. The silence was oppressive, like the forest itself was waiting for something. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I threw my pack into the back seat and started the engine, ready to leave that place behind. But as I pulled onto the narrow road, I glanced in my rearview mirror and froze. Standing at the edge of the forest just beyond where the trees met the road was a figure. It was tall and thin, its body pale and barely visible in the early morning light. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I blinked and it was gone. I floored the gas, speeding down the winding road, trying to shake the image from my mind. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, that something had followed me out of the woods. It's been weeks since that night, but I can't forget what happened. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps. Slow, deliberate, just outside my window, and every time I look, there's nothing there. Just the faint rustling of the wind through the trees, and the oppressive silence that's followed me ever since. I never thought I'd be the type to enjoy camping. The idea of disconnecting from the world, no phone, no Wi-Fi, seemed more like a nightmare than a vacation. But when my friend Eric invited me on this weekend trip to the woods, I figured, why not? I could use the break. It was just going to be me, him, and his girlfriend Sarah. Simple, relaxing. A little fire, some marshmallows, stargazing. Innocent fun. We set out early, the sun shining, birds chirping, the whole postcard scene. The drive took longer than expected, winding down back roads until we reached a secluded spot miles from the nearest sign of civilization. As we set up the tent and unpacked, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. There weren't many birds anymore, no rustling of leaves. Just an oppressive stillness, like the forest was waiting for something. But I brushed it off. I was just a city kid out of his element. By nightfall, we were around the campfire, roasting hot dogs, laughing, the smell of pine and smoke filling the air. Sarah was telling some ridiculous ghost story, the kind you expect on a trip like this, about some ancient spirit who haunted the woods watching campers from the shadows. I didn't take it seriously. None of us did. But then came the sound. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the crackling of the fire. A soft rustling in the trees, like something moving through the brush just beyond the glow of our camp. I tried to laugh it off as a deer or maybe a raccoon, but when Eric stood up with a frown, looking into the dark, I knew he heard it too. Probably just an animal, he said, his voice not entirely convincing. Sarah nodded, though her eyes darted around, scanning the dark edges of the forest. We went back to our conversation, but that uneasy feeling lingered. The night grew colder, the wind picking up, making the trees sway and creak. I swear, every time the fire flickered, I saw movement just out of sight. Shadows shifting, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. I told myself it was just the fire playing tricks on me. Around midnight, we called it a night. Sarah went into the tent and Eric and I stayed up a bit longer, finishing off the last of the beers. That's when we heard it again, louder this time, closer. A snap, like a twig breaking underfoot. I froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Eric didn't respond, his eyes locked on the tree line. The firelight barely illuminated the first few rows of trees, and beyond that, pure blackness. "Who's there?" Eric called out, his voice wavering. There was no answer, just the wind. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the night air, but beyond that, nothing. No footsteps, no animals scurrying away. Just silence. "Maybe we should head in," I suggested, my voice low, trying to sound calm. Eric nodded quickly. We zipped ourselves into the tent and lay there in the dark, trying to fall asleep. But the sounds didn't stop. I could hear faint rustling, soft footsteps circling the campsite. Every time I thought they were gone, they'd start up again, closer. I kept telling myself it had to be an animal, but animals don't move like that. It was slow, deliberate. Too human. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first, until I heard it. Breathing. Not inside the tent, but right outside. Soft, shallow, deliberate. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I held my breath, trying to stay perfectly still, my heart pounding in my chest. The breathing was getting louder, like whoever, or whatever it was right behind the thin fabric of the tent. Then a scratch. Slow, deliberate, something dragging across the tent wall, right where my head was. I couldn't move. I couldn't even bring myself to wake Eric. I just lay there staring at the dark ceiling of the tent, my heart racing. And then the scratching stopped. I don't know how long I stayed awake, terrified, but eventually the sounds faded, and somehow I drifted off. I woke up to daylight and the sound of birds. For a moment I thought maybe it had all been some horrible dream. But then I saw Eric and Sarah standing by the fire pit, staring at something. I crawled out of the tent, rubbing my eyes. "What is it?" I asked. Eric didn't say anything. He just pointed. Footprints. Not animal. Human. Barefoot. They circled the tent, then led off into the woods, disappearing into the undergrowth. "We should go," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Eric didn't argue. We packed up in record time, the tension thick between us. None of us wanted to say it out loud, but we all knew something had been watching us. Something had been there. As we hiked back to the car, the woods seemed different, the trees taller, the shadows deeper. And then, as we neared the car, I noticed something odd. The same footprints, barefoot, leading up to the driver's side door. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as Eric and Sarah caught up, and we all saw it at the same time. Sarah gasped, and Eric swore under his breath. The footprints didn't just lead up to the car, they came from inside it. That was when I noticed the back door was slightly open, just a crack. I swallowed hard, feeling my stomach twist into a knot. "No," I whispered. "We locked it, right?" No one answered. Eric, trying to stay calm, opened the door wider, and we all stared inside. There, on the back seat, was a single object that didn't belong to any of us. A mask, worn, dirty, made of some kind of animal hide and shaped like a face. And then the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever, or whatever, had been outside our tent last night hadn't just watched us. They had followed us. I've always loved camping. There's something peaceful about being alone in the woods, surrounded by nothing but nature. No people, no noise, just the crackling of a fire and the rustle of leaves in the wind. I'd done it countless times, in all sorts of places, but this trip was different. This time I decided to push myself, really test my limits. I found an isolated spot deep in the wilderness, miles from the nearest road. It was perfect, or so I thought. The forest was vast and untouched, its thick canopy shrouding the ground in a permanent twilight. The path I followed was barely a trail, just a faint game trail winding through the trees. By the time I reached a small clearing beside a stream, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was crisp, and the mist that clung to the ground gave the woods an otherworldly feel. I set up camp quickly, pitched my tent, and built a small fire. As the flames crackled to life, the mist seemed to retreat, allowing me a brief moment of comfort. I sat by the fire, cooking a simple meal, the quiet surrounding me like a blanket. For a while it was exactly what I had wanted, a perfect escape from the noise of everyday life. But as the darkness deepened and the fire began to die down, a strange unease settled over me. It started with the silence. The forest, which should have been alive with the sounds of insects and nocturnal animals, was utterly still. Not even the rustle of leaves in the wind broke the quiet. It felt like the world was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. But then I heard it. A soft crunch, like a footstep, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I froze, straining to listen. At first I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But the sound didn't continue. It was just one step. Then, nothing. I shone my flashlight toward the trees, but the beam barely penetrated the dense mist that had rolled back in. I couldn't see anything. After a few minutes of waiting, the sound didn't return, and I convinced myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a branch falling from a tree. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. I banked the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. Lying there, cocooned in my sleeping bag, I listened intently to the silence, waiting for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just the soft trickle of the stream and the occasional crackle from the dying fire. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of something brushing against my tent. My heart pounded in my chest. It wasn't the wind. There hadn't been any wind all night. The sound was soft, like fingers lightly tracing the fabric of the tent. I held my breath, listening as the sound circled around me, slow and deliberate. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking. When I turned it on, the light illuminated the inside of the tent, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. I waited, frozen, listening to the strange brushing sound, but the moment the light came on, it stopped. I waited a long time, my heart hammering in my chest, but the sound didn't return. Eventually, I convinced myself it had to be a branch, or maybe some animal brushing against the tent. Still, I kept the flashlight clutched tightly in my hand as I lay back down, my nerves on edge. I didn't sleep well after that. The next morning I stepped out of the tent, exhausted but relieved to see the pale light of dawn filtering through the trees. The mist was still thick, clinging to the ground like a living thing. I scanned the clearing, half expecting to see signs of something or someone having been there, but everything looked normal, except for one thing. Around my tent, in the soft earth, were footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, barefoot, and they circled my tent several times before disappearing into the woods. My stomach twisted as I stared at the prints. They weren't mine. I had been inside the tent all night, and they were fresh. I packed up camp in record time, stuffing my gear into my backpack without bothering to eat or rest. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something watching me from the trees. But the woods were empty, as silent as ever. As I started the long hike back to my car, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I kept my hand on the knife strapped to my belt, my nerves on edge with every step. The trail, which had seemed so clear on the way in, now felt foreign, the trees unfamiliar, the mist disorienting. Hours passed, and the unease grew into a gnawing dread. The silence was oppressive, and every now and then I would hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me. When I stopped, they stopped. When I quickened my pace, so did they. By the time I reached the spot where I had parked my car, the sun was already beginning to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the dirt road. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, desperate to get inside and leave this place behind. But when I reached the car, I stopped cold. There, pressed into the dirt on the side of the car, were handprints. Dozens of them, smeared across the windows and the doors, as if someone or something had been circling the vehicle, touching it, feeling it. The handprints were small, too small to be an adult's. My heart pounded in my chest as I yanked open the car door, threw my gear inside, and jumped behind the wheel. I started the engine, the sound of the motor breaking the silence, and slammed on the gas, speeding down the narrow dirt road, the forest blurring past me. As I drove, I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing on the road behind me. But there was nothing, just the mist, swirling in the distance. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in the safety of civilization. But even now, days later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me out of that forest. Something that's still watching. And I swear sometimes late at night I hear the soft sound of footsteps just outside my window. don't think I'll ever go camping again. I thought it'd be good for us, a way to reset, me, Matt, and Jess, just us three. A little getaway from the city. I'm not much of an outdoors person, but Matt had convinced me. Said the fresh air would do us all some good. Clear our heads, get back to nature, all that stuff. I didn't argue. I needed a break too. The drive to the campsite was uneventful, but something felt off the moment we arrived. It wasn't anything obvious, just a subtle feeling, like the woods were too quiet. No bird song, no wind through the trees. Even Jess, who usually loved stuff like this, made a comment about how the place felt. Empty. Still, we brushed it off. We were miles away from any towns, deep in the wilderness. Maybe that's just what untouched nature feels like. Silent. Alien. We set up camp by the lake, a glassy surface surrounded by towering pines, their needles a deep, unnatural green. The water was so still it felt frozen, like it was holding its breath. Matt made a joke about the place being straight out of a horror movie, and we laughed, but something about his voice seemed forced, nervous. The first night was fine, mostly. We sat around the fire talking and drinking, the crackle of burning wood filling the void of the silent forest. The stars above were bright, almost too bright, like they were watching us. I noticed Jess staring at the tree line a lot, her eyes darting over the shadows as if she was seeing something we couldn't. I didn't say anything. I just figured she was a little spooked. We all were. It wasn't until the second night that things started getting weird. We were sitting by the fire again talking when Matt stopped mid-sentence, his head snapping toward the trees like he'd heard something. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. I hadn't heard anything, but Jess nodded, her face pale in the firelight. It sounded like whispering. We all went quiet, listening. At first there was nothing, just the same oppressive silence that had been hanging over the place since we arrived. But then, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard it too. A faint, barely there murmur, like voices carried on the wind. But there was no wind. "It's probably just the trees," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice trembled. "Wind in the branches or something." Matt stood up, peering into the darkness beyond the fire's glow. "There's no wind." He was right. The air was dead still. For the rest of the night, none of us could relax. The whispers came and went, never close, but always there, just out of reach. Jess kept pacing around, muttering that we should pack up and leave, but Matt insisted we stay, said it was probably just animals. But animals don't whisper. When we finally went to bed, the tent felt like a prison. Every little sound outside had me on edge, the rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamt of dark shapes moving just beyond the edge of the firelight, watching us. The next morning, Jess was gone. Her tent was empty, her stuff still inside. We searched the woods, calling her name, but there was no trace of her. The only thing we found was her flashlight, lying by the lake, the bulb shattered like she'd dropped it in a hurry. Matt was frantic, saying we needed to go for help, but I could barely think straight. The woods felt wrong. The air was thick, almost suffocating, like the trees were closing in on us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was out there, watching us, waiting. By midday, we still hadn't found Jess, and Matt was losing it. He kept pacing by the water, muttering to himself, his eyes darting to the trees like he was expecting something to come out at any moment. I tried to calm him down, but then I heard it again, the whispers. Only this time they were louder, closer. "We need to go," Matt said, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here now." We packed up as fast as we could, but by the time we started hiking back to the car, the sun was already setting, casting long, twisted shadows through the trees. The whispers followed us the whole way, growing louder, more frantic, like whatever was making them was right behind us. When we reached the car, it was dark. Matt fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling so badly he dropped them. As he bent to pick them up, I saw something move in the shadows at the edge of the parking lot. "Matt, hurry," I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. but it was too late. He froze, standing up slowly, his eyes wide as he stared at something over my shoulder. I turned around and there, standing in the trees, was Jess. But something was wrong. She was too still, too silent. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, and then she smiled. Only it wasn't Jess's smile. It was too wide, too unnatural, stretching across her face like someone had carved it there. Before I could react, Matt screamed and bolted toward the car. But the second he reached it, the whispers exploded into a cacophony of voices, all overlapping, all saying the same thing. Run. I didn't run. I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the spot as I watched Matt scramble into the car, slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life, and he floored it, speeding down the dirt road without looking back. I was alone. Jess, or whatever that thing was, had disappeared into the trees, but the whispers remained, circling around me, growing louder, more insistent. I should have run. I should have tried to escape. But instead, I found myself walking toward the lake, my body moving on its own, the whispers guiding me. As I reached the water's edge, I looked down and saw my reflection. But it wasn't me. The face staring back at me was someone else, something else. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth twisted into that same unnatural smile Jess had worn. And then I realized I hadn't been the one hearing the whispers. I'd been the one making them, all along. I'll be honest, I'm not a nature guy. But when Mike suggested we take a camping trip, a guy's weekend in the deep woods, I figured, why not? A break from the usual grind sounded good. Mike's a seasoned outdoorsman anyway, so I felt pretty safe tagging along. We drove up to this remote patch of forest he knew about, far from any trails. No cell service, no people, just trees, sky, and the kind of silence you don't realize you miss until it swallows you whole. It was a nice change of pace at first. Peaceful. It wasn't until the sun dipped below the trees that I started to notice something was off. The campfire crackled between us, spitting embers into the darkening sky. Mike was lounging in his chair, looking totally relaxed, like he'd done this 100 times. Me? I kept glancing over my shoulder at the woods. The darkness felt thick, like it was closing in faster than it should. The rustling leaves and snapping twigs suddenly felt less like wind or animals, and more like we weren't alone. I'll grab some more wood, I said, needing an excuse to move, shake the unease crawling up my spine. Mike grunted, barely acknowledging me as I wandered into the trees, flashlight bouncing with each step. I didn't stray far, but even a few yards from the fire, the world seemed to swallow me. The trees stretched taller, the air colder. I was surrounded by the low hum of the forest, the distant call of something. Not a bird, not a coyote. Something else. It didn't sound quite right. My flashlight flickered. I cursed and shook it. Stupid, cheap thing. It stabilized, but for a split second when the light flared back on, I thought I saw something between the trees. A figure. Tall, thin, just standing there watching. I whipped the beam back. Nothing. Just dense forest. The trees swayed gently, casting long, skeletal shadows across the ground. I headed back to the camp, wood bundled awkwardly in my arms, my heart pounding a little too fast. Mike barely looked up when I tossed the logs by the fire. "Cold already?" he asked, grinning. "Yeah, it's getting a bit chilly," I muttered, trying to play off the unease. That's when I heard it again, the call, low, guttural, almost human but not quite, like it was mimicking something it didn't fully understand. I froze. "Did you hear that?" Mike's grin faltered. "What?" "That sound, it came from over there." He listened for a moment, then shrugged. "Probably just a fox or something." I didn't say anything. Foxes don't sound like that. But I wasn't about to argue. I sat down, trying to push the strange call from my mind, chalking it up to my unfamiliarity with the woods. The night dragged on. Every time the wind picked up, I heard that eerie sound again, closer now. Each time, Mike dismissed it. I was starting to wonder if he could even hear it at all. Hours passed, and exhaustion finally crept in. Mike went to his tent first, leaving me alone by the fire. The flames had died down, casting faint orange light around the clearing. I was about to pack it in too when I saw it again. A figure standing just beyond the firelight. My heart seized. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long for its body. The shadows clung to it like it didn't belong in this world. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them, hidden in the black void where a face should be. I stood slowly, not wanting to provoke whatever it was. Mike, get up. There's something out here, I whispered, trying to keep the panic from my voice. He didn't respond. I backed toward his tent, keeping my eyes on the thing. Mike! I hissed louder. Still nothing. I turned and yanked open the tent flap, and my blood ran cold. Mike wasn't there. The sleeping bag was neatly rolled up, untouched. It was like he had never been here at all. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, the fire barely flickering now, casting the world in deep shadows. The figure was gone. The forest felt wrong, too quiet, too still. The oppressive silence pressed against my ears, and I realized the woods had gone dead. Not a single sound. No wind, no leaves rustling. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it wildly into the trees. Nothing but shadows. And then I heard it. Help! A faint, familiar voice. Mike's voice. But it was wrong. Warped, distorted, coming from the direction of the figure. Mike, I called, desperate, my voice shaking. Help me, it repeated, closer now, almost right beside me. I swung the flashlight around, my breath catching in my throat. Standing just outside the circle of dying firelight was Mike, or something that looked like him. His face was slack, his eyes empty. He smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far across his face. Help me, he said again, but it wasn't his voice anymore. It was that same low, guttural sound I'd heard earlier. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This thing wasn't Mikey. I turned to run, but froze. All around the camp, standing between the trees, were more figures, dozens of them, watching, silent. Some tall, others short, but all of them wrong, twisted like they were made of shadows and bones. Their heads tilted, their dark eyes fixed on me. And then I realized none of them were moving. None of them were breathing. They were all watching me, and I understood in that moment something I wish I hadn't. Something terrible. Mike had never existed. There had never been anyone else on this trip, and I was alone. But not really alone. Because they were here, they had always been here, watching. And now, they were waiting for me to join them. As the fire died and darkness swallowed the clearing, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to make it out of these woods. I already belonged to them. I always thought camping alone would be peaceful. Just me, the trees, and the sounds of nature surrounding me, giving me a break from the chaos of the world. I'd done it plenty of times before, but this time was different. It was supposed to be a weekend of solitude, a chance to clear my mind. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my life. I drove out early, the sun barely rising, eager to reach a spot deep in the wilderness that I'd discovered months ago. It was perfect. Far off the beaten trail, nestled beside a small stream, with thick trees creating a natural barrier around the clearing. No cell service, no people, just silence. The hike to the spot was longer than I remembered, the forest denser, more suffocating, but I didn't mind. I welcomed the isolation. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already low in the sky, casting an eerie orange glow over everything. I quickly set up my tent, started a small fire, and sat back to enjoy the quiet. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned dark, something felt off. It wasn't immediate. It crept in slowly, like a pressure building in my chest. The forest around me seemed too quiet, like the usual night sounds. The chirping of insects, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush were muted. I could still hear the stream trickling nearby, but even that sounded distant, like it was further away than it should have been. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just adjusting to being alone out here. I had a cup of coffee, stared at the fire, and tried to relax, but the feeling only got worse. There was something wrong with the air, like it was heavy, thick, making it hard to breathe. Then the noises started. At first it was a soft rustling, almost too quiet to notice. Just the wind, I thought, brushing through the trees. But the sound was steady, deliberate, and it seemed to circle my camp, staying just outside the reach of the firelight. I stood up, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the flickering flames. "Hello?" I called out, feeling a little stupid for speaking to the empty woods. But no one answered. The rustling stopped. I waited, listening, my heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. For a moment, everything was still again. I sat back down, poking at the fire, trying to shake the creeping unease. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, something curious but harmless. I didn't feel any better. A few hours passed and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. The woods were pitch black now, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. I decided to call it a night and climbed into my tent, zipping it up tight. I didn't know why I felt the need to lock myself in, but something told me to. I lay there in the darkness, listening. That's when I heard it again. The rustling, louder this time, closer. It wasn't circling the camp anymore. It was right outside the tent. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat feeling like a hammer. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear. The rustling stopped directly beside me, and I could hear something breathing. Deep, slow breaths, almost like it was smelling the tent, smelling me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to control the panic rising in my throat. It's just an animal. It'll go away. But the breathing didn't stop. It stayed there, for what felt like hours, just outside the thin layer of nylon separating me from whatever was out there. And then it spoke. Not words, not exactly, but a low, garbled sound, like something trying to mimic speech. The noise twisted and warbled, like a voice broken into pieces, repeating something I couldn't understand. It sent chills down my spine. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. My mind raced through every possibility. Was it a person? But no human made sounds like that. Was it some kind of animal? But animals don't try to talk. They don't breathe like that. And then, without warning, the tent collapsed inward as if someone, was pressing down on it, hard. I could see the fabric bowing under the weight, and I swear I saw a hand, pale and long, pressing against the top of the tent, slowly dragging its fingers across the surface. I snapped. I grabbed my flashlight, fumbled with the zipper, and burst out of the tent, shining the beam into the night. Nothing. The clearing was empty, the fire long dead, the trees standing silently like they had been all night. But the air was wrong. The oppressive heaviness was still there, and I could feel it watching me, even if I couldn't see it. I stood there for what felt like hours, flashlight shaking in my hand, heart pounding in my ears. Slowly, I backed away from the tent, my every instinct screaming at me to run. But my legs wouldn't listen. I kept turning, shining the light into the trees, expecting to see something, anything, lurking just beyond the reach of the beam. And then I saw it. A figure, pale, thin, unnaturally tall, standing between the trees at the edge of the clearing. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. But it watched me. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. I bolted. I didn't pack up. I didn't even try. I just grabbed my keys and ran. The hike back to the car was a blur, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I stumbled through the dark. The whole time, I could hear it behind me, that same rustling, that same breathing following me, always just out of sight but never far enough away. I don't know how long I ran, but I eventually reached my car, threw myself inside, and sped out of there without looking back. I haven't gone camping since. I barely sleep at night anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that breathing, feel that presence just outside my room, watching, waiting. And every now and then, when I'm lying in bed, too terrified to sleep, I hear that garbled, broken voice trying to speak again. But I'll never understand what it's trying to say. I've always loved the wilderness. There's something about being completely alone in nature that calms me, helps me reset. So when I found this spot online, a secluded forest deep in the Pacific Northwest, it seemed perfect. No tourists, no cell phone signal, just me and the trees. I packed up my gear and set out for what I thought would be a peaceful weekend of camping. The trailhead was hard to find, almost like it didn't want to be discovered. My GPS kept glitching, but I chalked it up to the remoteness. After hours of hiking, I finally found the clearing I'd seen online. It was surrounded by towering pines, their branches so dense they blocked out the sunlight, casting long shadows across the forest floor. But the spot was perfect. Quiet, isolated, and far from any sign of civilization. As evening fell, I set up my tent, built a fire, and settled in. The first strange thing happened just after dusk. I was sitting by the fire, watching the flames dance, when I noticed the forest around me was too quiet. No crickets, no birds, not even the rustling of leaves in the wind. Just silence. It felt wrong, unnatural, but I brushed it off as city nerves. Maybe I just wasn't used to this level of quiet. But then came the footsteps. Faint at first, like someone walking through the underbrush. I looked around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Still, the feeling of being watched crept over me like a cold hand on the back of my neck. I told myself it was just my imagination and retreated to my tent, hoping that sleep would come quickly. It didn't. Around midnight I heard the sound again, footsteps, but this time they were closer, circling my tent. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed the knife I always kept in my pack and slowly unzipped the tent, trying to be as quiet as possible. My flashlight flickered as I swept it through the trees, the beam weak and erratic. Nothing, just darkness and shadows. I could still feel it, though. That heavy, oppressive feeling of being watched. I forced myself to breathe, to calm down, and after what felt like an eternity, I crawled back into the tent. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard whispers, faint, unintelligible, like they were carried on the wind. But there was no wind. The air was still, suffocating. I couldn't tell if the voices were outside or in my head. By the time dawn came, I was exhausted. My nerves were shot and I was ready to pack up and leave. But something stopped me. Maybe pride, maybe stupidity. I told myself I was overreacting. It was just one weird night. So I stayed, and that was my mistake. The second night, everything escalated. It started with the fire. I had gathered wood earlier and set it ablaze just after sunset. But as I sat by it, trying to convince myself that the daylight had burned away the fear, the flames suddenly died, snuffed out like someone had thrown water on them. I scrambled to relight it, but the matches wouldn't catch. It was as if the air itself refused to ignite. Then the noises returned, this time louder. Footsteps, yes, but also something else. Breathing. Ragged, heavy breathing. It was all around me, surrounding the camp. My flashlight, now fully dead, was useless. I could feel the presence, whatever it was, getting closer. I ran for my tent, but before I could reach it, I saw something move in the trees. At first it was just a shadow slipping between the trunks, but then I saw it. Pale, gaunt, and inhumanly tall. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, not with light, but with something darker, something wrong. It didn't move like a person, more like... It glided, its limbs too long, its face twisted in a permanent silent scream. I froze, my body refused to move. The thing stared at me from the edge of the clearing. And then, slowly, it pointed. Not at me, but at something behind me. I turned, and that's when I saw them, figures, dozens of them standing just beyond the ring of trees. They were transparent, like wisps of smoke, but they were there, silent, watching. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and hungry. Panicking, I grabbed my backpack and ran. I didn't care where, I just needed to get away. Branches tore at my skin, and my lungs burned as I ran through the trees, but no matter how far I went, I could still hear the footsteps behind me, matching my pace. Eventually I collapsed, exhausted, and waited for whatever it was to find me. But the footsteps stopped. The silence returned. Slowly, I lifted my head, half expecting to see the pale figure looming over me, but there was nothing. I was alone. Shaking, I got back on my feet and somehow managed to stumble back to my campsite. My tent was gone. Everything, my gear, my supplies, vanished without a trace. In their place was something else, an old, rotting campsite, the remains of a tent torn and weathered with age. But this campsite, it looked familiar. And then it hit me. It was mine. My backpack, my supplies, everything. It was there, but aged, decayed, like it had been left there for years. I heard the whisper again, closer this time. You never left. I ran, my heart pounding in my ears. I don't remember how I made it out of that forest, but when I reached the trailhead, something was waiting for me, an old, rusted sign I hadn't noticed before, half buried in the dirt. It read, "Trail closed, missing persons, 1974. And, beneath it, almost too faded to read, "Do not enter after dark." As I stood there trembling, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. A voice, faint and distant, whispered, "Welcome back." And that's when I realized I'd never left. I was one of them now, trapped in that endless ghostly cycle. No one ever leaves. The woods were always a place of comfort for me, an escape from the hectic demands of daily life. Growing up, I spent countless weekends camping with my family, so when I decided to take a solo trip to clear my head, it didn't seem like a big deal. I knew the routine: pack light, bring plenty of water, and always respect the wilderness. This time, I chose a spot deep in a national forest, far from any marked trails, somewhere I could get truly lost in nature. It was late October, the air crisp, with the trees shedding the last of their red and gold leaves. I found a secluded clearing near a small stream and set up camp. There was no cell signal out here, but that was exactly what I wanted. Isolation, time to think, and nothing but the forest to keep me company. For the first day, it was perfect. I hiked around, gathered firewood, and spent the evening by the campfire, listening to the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional call of an owl. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a strange sensation settled over me. It was subtle, like a shift in the atmosphere, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. I brushed it off as the typical unease that comes with being alone in the wilderness. After all, it's easy to get spooked when it's just you in the dark. But that night, as I lay in my tent, something wasn't right. At first it was small noises, twigs snapping, leaves crunching, the normal sounds of the forest at night. But they seemed closer, too close, like something was moving just outside the tent. I grabbed my flashlight, heart thudding in my chest, and shined it through the thin fabric. Nothing. Just shadows. I closed my eyes and tried to fall asleep, telling myself it was just an animal passing through. But then, at around 3 a.m., I heard it, a low, shuffling sound right by my head, like something or someone was circling the tent, slow, deliberate steps crunching through the fallen leaves. It wasn't the skittish movements of a deer or the quick scurrying of a raccoon. This was something heavy, purposeful. I held my breath, gripping my flashlight tightly. I was certain if I made any noise, whatever was out there would hear me. The steps stopped right outside the entrance of the tent. I could hear breathing now, slow and raspy, almost like someone struggling to suck in air through damaged lungs. My heart pounded in my ears, louder than the forest around me. Then something tugged at the tent, just a light pull on one of the zippers, barely enough to move it, but enough to know that whatever was out there wasn't just curious. It was trying to get in. I sat there frozen, too terrified to move, trying to think of what to do. I hadn't brought a weapon, I never felt the need for one out here. I was miles from civilization, and the closest thing I had to protection was the dull camp knife in my backpack. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? A person? But something in my gut told me that this was neither. And then it spoke. Not in words, not really, but in a low, guttural growl that almost formed the sound of a voice. It was as if the forest itself had learned to speak, a twisted, unnatural mimicry of human speech. The sound sent chills down my spine. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it felt right. I clamped my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. The thing outside circled the tent again, slowly, its steps dragging in the dirt, until it stopped at the back where the fabric was stretched thin. The tent wall sagged slightly as if something pressed against it from the other side. I could make out the vague outline of a figure, tall, impossibly thin, with arms that hung too long at its sides, almost dragging on the ground. It crouched low, its face now mere inches from where I was lying. I could feel it, not just physically but in my mind. A presence, ancient and malevolent, something that had been here long before humans ever walked these woods. It whispered again, this time closer to language but distorted, garbled. "Come, out," it rasped, the words twisting in the air like they didn't belong to any living thing. My breath caught in my throat, my muscles locked in fear. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. For what felt like hours, it stayed there, crouched outside the tent as if waiting for me to answer. Then, without warning, the presence lifted. I heard it retreat, the slow, shuffling footsteps fading into the distance. The air in the tent was thick, suffocating, but I didn't move, afraid that if I did, it would come back. At dawn, I finally found the courage to unzip the tent and step outside. The clearing was bathed in cold, pale light, but there were no signs of anything unusual. No tracks, no disturbed foliage. It was as if the thing had never been there at all. But I knew better. The feeling of being watched hadn't left. The woods still felt hostile, like they were keeping something hidden, something just beyond my sight. I packed up in record time, not caring about breakfast or even the fire I had let die out. I needed to get out. The hike back to the trailhead took most of the day, and the entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, staying just out of sight, moving when I wasn't looking. As I reached the trailhead and finally stepped onto the dirt road that would lead me back to civilization, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The forest behind me seemed to breathe a collective sigh, as if it had let me go, for now. But I couldn't forget what I'd heard. That voice, those words. A few weeks later, I did some research on the area, just to try and make sense of it. I found old stories, local legends passed down by the indigenous people of the region. They spoke of the Wendigo, a creature born of the forest, a twisted spirit that mimics human voices to lure its victims deeper into the wilderness. They said it was always hungry, always hunting. I haven't gone camping since, and sometimes late at night I hear it again, that raspy voice, faint but clear, whispering just outside my window. "Come, out." I don't know why I thought camping alone would be a good idea. Maybe it was the allure of silence, the promise of disconnecting from the noise of the city, or just the challenge of pushing my limits. I've always been an outdoorsman, but never this deep in the woods, never this isolated. I found the campsite tucked away near a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines and dense underbrush. It was miles from any trailhead. No cell service, no people for at least a day's hike in any direction, perfect for the solitude I thought I needed. The first day was uneventful. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and settled in. The stillness was unnerving at first, but eventually it became almost meditative. By nightfall, I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, trying to shake the strange sensation that I was being watched. I told myself it was just the isolation messing with my head. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something felt off. As the fire dwindled, I started hearing it, soft at first, almost like the wind rustling the trees, but different. It was a distant whisper, a murmur, just beyond the tree line. I paused, straining to listen, but it stopped as soon as I focused on it. Brushing it off, I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, convincing myself it was nothing but the woods playing tricks on my mind. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every time I began to drift off, I'd hear the whisper again, closer, louder, more distinct. It wasn't just the wind, it was a voice, and it was calling my name. I shot up in my sleeping bag, heart racing, ears straining for any sound beyond the tent's thin walls. Silence. Complete and utter silence. But now I was wide awake, adrenaline coursing through me. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. The night was still. Too still. Not a single cricket chirped, no wind in the trees. The forest around me felt suffocating, like it was waiting for something. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, but it did little to ease the oppressive feeling hanging over the campsite. I scanned the tree line, expecting to see what? An animal? A person? But there was nothing, just the endless stretch of woods. I decided to stoke the fire, adding more wood until the flames roared again. It brought some comfort, at least enough to convince me I was safe for the moment. But then I saw them. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no. There, just beyond the light of the fire, stood a figure. Pale, almost translucent. It was a woman, her face hidden in shadow, but I could see her outline, see her long, tattered dress blowing gently as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The whispering returned, louder now, insistent, circling me. I couldn't understand the words, but I knew they were meant for me. I blinked, and she was gone. I stumbled back into the tent, zipped it up, and grabbed the knife I'd brought. I held it in front of me, hand trembling. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of trick, a hallucination from exhaustion or fear. The night dragged on, every minute feeling like an hour. The whispers continued, growing louder. Sometimes right next to my ear, other times fading into the distance. But they never stopped. Eventually, I must have passed out from sheer exhaustion because when I opened my eyes again, it was morning. The sunlight streaming through the tent brought a small measure of relief, but the dread hadn't left. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, eager to get out of those woods, to get back to civilization. As I hiked, though, something felt wrong. I couldn't quite place it, but the forest seemed different. The trees, they didn't look like they did the day before. The path I had taken in didn't seem familiar anymore. I was starting to panic, my breathing becoming shallow. Then I saw it, a clearing up ahead. Relief flooded through me as I picked up the pace. But when I broke through the trees, my heart dropped into my stomach. It was the same campsite, my campsite, the same fire pit, the same tent stakes still lodged in the ground. I had been walking in circles. Impossible. I knew I had been going in a straight line, following the map. I hadn't turned around. I hadn't made a mistake. That's when I heard it again. The whisper, clear as day now, coming from directly behind me. I spun around, and there she was, the same pale figure, standing no more than 10 feet away. But now I could see her face. Hollow eyes stared at me, her mouth moving slowly, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "You shouldn't have come here." I stumbled backward, my pulse pounding in my ears. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It felt like the ground beneath me was pulling me down, like invisible hands were gripping my ankles. Suddenly I was falling, the earth giving way beneath me, plunging me into darkness. I woke up in my tent, heart hammering in my chest, the sunlight once again streaming in. For a moment, I thought it was all a dream, but my body ached. Dirt clung to my clothes, and the whispers were still there, faint, lingering at the edge of my hearing. I packed up and left, following the same path out of the woods. But when I finally emerged, I saw the sign. A faded, weathered wooden sign covered in moss, barely readable. Campsite closed 1978, fatal accident, 2 campers missing, presumed dead. My blood ran cold. As I stood there, frozen, I glanced back at the forest. The shadows between the trees seemed darker, thicker, and for a brief moment, I saw her again, just at the edge of the woods watching me. I turned and ran. But now, even back home, far from those woods, I still hear the whispering. Every night it grows louder. Every night it's closer. And I don't think I'll ever escape it. Camping has always been a refuge for me, somewhere to escape the noise and chaos of the city. But after what happened last summer, I'm not sure I'll ever set foot in the woods again. I had planned a weekend trip with 3 friends, Sarah, Jake, and Luke. We'd found this remote campsite, miles away from the nearest town, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. No cell service, no roads for miles. Just us, the wilderness, and the stars. The drive was long, but when we finally arrived, the view was breathtaking. Towering trees surrounded us, their thick branches almost blocking out the sky. The air was cool and fresh, with the scent of pine and damp earth. We set up camp beside a wide clearing, a perfect spot for a fire, with just enough open space for us to lie back and stargaze. The first night was uneventful. We shared some laughs around the fire, told the usual ghost stories, and eventually drifted off to sleep in our tents. It wasn't until the second night that things took a turn. It started with the wind. A sudden sharp gust swept through the clearing, almost strong enough to put out the fire. The trees groaned under its weight, their branches creaking like old wood, and the temperature dropped fast. At first we thought it was just a storm rolling in, but the sky was clear, not a cloud in sight. And the wind, it wasn't natural. It came in bursts, starting and stopping, almost like it was breathing. Jake was the first to notice something strange. "Do you hear that?" he asked, cocking his head to one side. We all fell silent, straining our ears. There was something just barely audible over the wind, a soft rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. It seemed to be coming from deep in the woods, but it echoed in a way that made it hard to tell how far. We exchanged uneasy glances, but none of us wanted to admit we were spooked. "Probably just a branch knocking against a tree," Luke said, though he didn't sound convinced. The tapping continued, growing louder as the night wore on, and soon it was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just random knocks anymore. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate, like footsteps. Sarah shivered. "I don't like this," she said. "It's too quiet." She was right. Aside from the wind and the tapping, the forest was dead silent. No crickets, no rustling of animals in the underbrush. Nothing. It was as if everything in the forest had gone still, waiting. We tried to brush it off, sitting closer to the fire, but the unease crept in like a shadow. That's when Sarah noticed something in the trees. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing toward the tree line. We all turned, squinting into the darkness beyond the firelight. At first I didn't see anything, but then, just for a moment, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It was tall, too tall to be a person, and its movements were wrong, jerky, unnatural, like it didn't quite understand how to move through the forest. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, the flickering flames playing with my eyes, but then I saw it again. And this time so did everyone else. "Who the hell is that?" Jake muttered, standing up, his eyes locked on the figure. We all stood, tense, as the figure moved closer to the edge of the clearing. It didn't come into the light, but it stayed just out of reach, pacing back and forth, like it was watching us. Luke grabbed the flashlight from his pack and shone it toward the trees, but as soon as the beam hit the figure, it was gone. Vanished like it had never been there. The woods fell silent again. The wind stopped, and for a moment all we could hear was the crackling of the fire and our own ragged breathing. "We need to go," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. We all agreed. We packed up quickly, stuffing our gear into our packs as fast as we could. But just as we were about to extinguish the fire, we heard it, the sound that still haunts me to this day. A voice, faint but clear. It came from the woods, from the exact spot where the figure had disappeared. And it was calling our names. not just any names. Our names. One by one, in that same eerie, breathy tone, it whispered each of us over and over again. Sarah's face went pale, and Luke dropped his flashlight, his hands trembling. No one moved. We just stood there, paralyzed by the sound. Then the voice changed. It stopped calling our names and began to mimic us. It was repeating things we had said earlier around the campfire, in the exact tone and cadence. Little jokes, offhand comments, things only we would know. It was like it was trying to lure us into the woods, to draw us away from the fire. Suddenly Jake broke the silence. "We need to leave now." Without another word, we grabbed our gear and bolted for the car, stumbling through the dark woods, the voice still calling after us, still repeating our words. I don't know how we made it back to the car without getting lost, but by the time we reached it, the voice had faded into the distance. We didn't speak on the drive home. We just sat there in silence, too shaken to process what had happened. But as we pulled onto the main road, Sarah broke down, sobbing. "I don't think it's over," she said through her tears. I didn't understand what she meant until I got home. Later that night, as I lay in bed, trying to shake off the unease of the trip, I heard it again. My name. It was soft, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. It came from the corner of the room, from the shadows. I sat up, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. And then I heard it again. This time it was laughing. I never told the others. But I know, deep down, that whatever was in those woods that night, it followed us home. And every once in a while, in the dead of night, I still hear it, calling my name. We had planned this trip for months. It was supposed to be a weekend of hiking, camping, and unwinding in the middle of nowhere. Just the four of us, me, my girlfriend Claire, and our friends Nate and Sophie. We were all craving an escape from the noise of the city, so we picked a remote spot in the woods by Cold Creek. The name sounded peaceful enough, right? Just a quiet little creek tucked away in the forest. But when we told the owner of the cabin where we parked the car that we'd be camping there, his face went a bit pale. "You be careful out there," he said. "Strange things happen near that creek." I remember laughing, thinking it was just some local trying to spook tourists. We were seasoned campers after all. We'd done this 100 times before. Nate joked about bringing a silver bullet and garlic, just in case. We didn't take him seriously. None of us did. We hiked deep into the woods that first day, farther than we'd planned, but the scenery was worth it. Massive trees towered over us, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. We followed the creek until we found the perfect clearing to set up camp. The creek water was cold and clear, and the only sound was the gentle rush of it flowing over the rocks. By the time night fell, we were exhausted but content. We lit a fire, cooked some food, and sat around telling stories. The stars were out, brighter than we'd ever seen them, and the only thing that seemed out of place was the thick fog that rolled in just after sunset, creeping in off the creek like a living thing. It hung low, swirling through the trees, but none of us were too bothered by it. It gave the night an eerie, mysterious vibe, which Nate leaned into by telling us a story he'd heard about Cold Creek. "You know this place has a history, right?" he started, flashing a grin at me and Claire. "Back in the 1800s, they say there was a village nearby. People settled here to farm and raise their families. But one year there was a brutal winter, the kind that starves a town, crops failed, food ran out. The story goes that they turned to, well, desperate measures." Sophie, who had been listening intently, narrowed her eyes. "Desperate measures? Like what?" Nate's grin faded. "Cannibalism." Claire groaned and tossed a marshmallow at him. "Seriously? That's the best you've got?" Nate shrugged. "I'm just saying there are legends about this place. They say you can still hear the cries of the lost villagers wandering the woods, hungry for something more." We all laughed it off, though there was a part of me that found it unsettling, especially with the fog thickening around us, creeping closer to our little circle of firelight. But eventually, we brushed it off as another spooky campfire story and turned in for the night. I woke up a few hours later. At first, I didn't know why. Everything was still, quiet, except for the soft rustling of the leaves. The fire had long since died down, and our tent was filled with the pale light of the moon filtering through the fog. I lay there listening, but something felt off. It was too quiet. No crickets, no wind, just an oppressive silence. And then I heard it, a faint splash like something or someone wading through the creek. At first I thought it was Nate or Sophie getting up to relieve themselves, but then I realized it was coming from further downstream, in the direction of the thickest part of the fog. The sound was slow, deliberate, like something was dragging itself through the water. I nudged Claire. "Do you hear that?" She groaned softly and sat up, listening. Her eyes widened as the splashing grew louder, now accompanied by a low, wet, gurgling sound, like someone trying to speak through water. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know." I reached for my flashlight, heart pounding in my chest, and unzipped the tent. Cold air rushed in, making me shiver, though it wasn't from the temperature. I shone the beam of light toward the creek, but the fog was so thick it swallowed the light almost immediately. The splashing stopped. For a few seconds, everything was still again. Claire and I exchanged a nervous glance, her hand gripping my arm. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crack echoed through the woods like a branch snapping under the weight of something heavy. We both jumped, and in the tent next to ours I heard Nate curse under his breath. "What the hell was that?" he called out, his voice muffled by the fabric of his tent. "I don't know," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Stay inside for now." Then we heard something else, a soft rhythmic sound almost like crying. It was faint, barely audible but unmistakable. It came from the direction of the creek, floating toward us on the fog. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Claire whispered, That's a child." I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. "There's no way. There's no one out here." But the sound persisted, growing louder, closer, as if the child was moving toward us. It was a soft, pitiful wail, and underneath it was something else. A strange, distorted whispering, like multiple voices speaking in unison. It felt wrong, like the air was being sucked out of the forest. I grabbed a rock from the fire pit and hurled it in the direction of the creek. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my voice shaky. "Show yourself." Nothing but silence. The crying had stopped, and now there was only the fog swirling unnaturally thick around us. Suddenly Sophie screamed. I whipped around to see her stumbling out of the tent, her face pale as death. "Nate's gone," she yelled. "He's gone." Claire and I rushed over. Sophie was shaking, pointing at the empty space where Nate had been sleeping. His sleeping bag was still zipped up, but he was gone, like he'd just disappeared without a trace. "There's no way he just left," Claire said, her voice trembling. I had always been drawn to places off the beaten path, the kind of wilderness where few people dared to go, where the land felt ancient and untouched. So when I heard about Black Hollow, a remote valley hidden deep within a forest preserve, I knew I had to go. There were rumors, of course. Locals in the nearby town wouldn't talk about it, or if they did, they kept it vague. One old man at the gas station shook his head when I asked for directions, muttering something about bad air and things that don't belong. I laughed it off. I'd heard all kinds of stories about haunted forests and cursed places. It was just folklore, passed down to keep people away. That's what I told myself anyway. The hike into Black Hollow was long and difficult. The trails were barely visible, overgrown and twisted, like the forest was reclaiming the land. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how quiet it was. The usual sounds of the forest, the birds, the wind through the leaves, were absent. It wasn't dead quiet, though. There was a sound, faint at first, just on the edge of hearing. A low, distant hum, almost like wind, but it never changed. It stayed constant, as if it were coming from the earth itself. By the time I reached the valley, the sun was already setting. Black Hollow was beautiful, I had to admit that. The trees were enormous, towering pines with roots that twisted and knotted above the ground. Moss clung to everything, a thick green carpet that muffled my footsteps. And yet, there was something unsettling about it. The air felt heavier, thicker, like I was walking through something more than just fog. I set up camp in a small clearing, the fire casting flickering light across the trees as the last of the daylight faded. I tried to relax, to enjoy the solitude, but the feeling of being watched nagged at me. Every time I looked up from the fire, I found myself glancing into the trees, expecting to see something there. But there was nothing, just shadows. As the night wore on, the hum I had heard earlier grew louder. It wasn't wind. I was sure of that now. It was more like a vibration, a deep thrumming that I could feel in my chest. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just some natural phenomenon I wasn't familiar with. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and settled into my sleeping bag. But sleep didn't come easily. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the ground, through the air, through me. I tossed and turned, trying to get comfortable, trying to convince myself that it was just in my head. And then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard something else. Footsteps, soft, slow, deliberate. They weren't far off, maybe 20 feet from the tent. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer, curious about the campfire, but the steps were too measured, too human. I grabbed my flashlight and sat up, listening. The footsteps stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything over the low hum that seemed to fill the entire valley. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the persistent vibration. And then the footsteps started again, closer this time. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, shining my light toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow over the clearing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the eerie quiet. No answer. The footsteps had stopped again, but I could feel something out there, just beyond the light. I stepped out of the tent, sweeping the flashlight around. The forest was still, too still. I moved toward the edge of the clearing, the light bobbing with my shaking hand. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another tree, a shadow among shadows. But as I moved the light across it, the figure took shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its head was tilted, like it was listening. I stood there, frozen, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the light. It just stood there, its hollow eyes staring right at me. Then, in a slow, jerky motion, it took a step forward. I backed up, nearly tripping over a root, my flashlight shaking wildly in my hand. The figure took another step, its long legs moving awkwardly, like it wasn't used to walking. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only watch as it moved closer, its head tilting further, like it was curious about me. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The hum in the air grew louder, almost deafening now. I could feel it vibrating through my bones, making my teeth chatter. The figure stood there, watching me, unmoving. And then, slowly, it raised one long, thin arm and pointed toward the woods. I didn't need any more encouragement. I turned and bolted back to my tent, grabbing only my backpack and the flashlight. I didn't bother with the rest of my gear. I didn't look back. The hike back to the car was a blur. The hum followed me the entire way, growing fainter as I put more distance between myself and the valley. But even when it faded completely, I could still feel it, a low vibration in the pit of my stomach. By the time I reached my truck, the sun was rising, casting pale light over the mountains. I drove out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away. I don't know what I saw in Black Hollow. I don't know if it was real, or if the isolation and the strange energy of the place had gotten to me. But every time I think about going back to the woods, I hear that hum again, and I remember how it felt to be watched, to be pointed toward something I didn't want to see. I won't be camping alone anymore, not ever again. It started as a simple camping trip. My buddy Alex and I had been planning it for months, a weekend away from the chaos of the city, just the two of us, deep in the wilderness. I've always loved the outdoors, the peace of it, the way the world felt raw and ancient out there. This time, though, something felt wrong. I could feel it the moment we crossed into the forest, the kind of stillness that presses against your skin, suffocating. We drove deeper than we ever had before, far off the beaten path, into the heart of an old-growth forest I'd only heard rumors about. No one goes out there anymore, a guy at the local gas station told us as we loaded up on supplies. I laughed it off at the time, but he wasn't joking. I saw it in his eyes. They were empty, hollow, like something had been sucked out of him long ago. The trail we followed had been overtaken by time, roots snaking through it, branches heavy and twisted, like they were reaching for us. As we hiked, the air felt thick, almost tangible, and it was quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no insects, just our footsteps and the sound of our breathing, loud and out of place. We set up camp near a clearing as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows that twisted into strange shapes. I felt watched, but when I looked around, nothing. Just the darkening woods, their edges blurred by the dusk. After we got the fire going, Alex started joking around, talking about how we should have brought more beer and how he was going to catch the biggest fish in the creek nearby. I smiled, but my heart wasn't in it. That uneasy feeling had lodged itself deep in my gut, like a splinter I couldn't shake. We sat by the fire, talking and laughing, trying to ignore the creeping darkness around us. Then, from the edge of the clearing, I saw it. A figure, just standing there watching us. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then Alex saw it too. He stopped mid-sentence, his face going pale. "Do you see that?" he whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. The figure didn't move, just stood there, a dark silhouette against the trees. We called out, but there was no response, no movement, just watching. After a few minutes, it turned and melted back into the shadows like it had never been there. Alex tried to laugh it off, but it was strained. "Probably just a hiker," he said, poking at the fire. "Nothing to worry about." But his hands were shaking. I could tell he didn't believe his own words. The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that presence, standing just beyond the firelight, waiting, watching. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of something, scraping, like nails on metal. I sat up, my heart pounding, the hairs on my arms standing on end. The fire had died down, leaving only glowing embers. Alex was still sleeping, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That's when I heard it again, the scraping closer now, coming from the trees. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The night was thick with fog, curling between the trees like ghostly fingers. The moon was high, casting pale light over the clearing. My breath felt loud in the silence. I walked toward the sound, every step feeling heavier than the last. My flashlight flickered, and for a second, I thought I saw something move just beyond the reach of its beam. My heart hammered in my chest, but I kept walking, drawn toward that terrible sound. Then I saw it. A figure hunched and twisted, dragging something through the dirt. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, its back to me. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, I saw its face. It wasn't human. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I ran back to the tent, shaking Alex awake. He groaned, annoyed, until he saw my face. I didn't have to say a word. He grabbed his flashlight, and we both stood there, waiting, listening. The scraping had stopped. For a long time, we didn't hear anything but our own breathing, shallow and fast. And then, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. We stood frozen, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. But nothing came. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent, and then there was silence. After what felt like an eternity, the first rays of dawn began to pierce the fog, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift just a little. We packed up in silence, neither of us saying a word about what had happened. We just wanted to get out of there. As we hiked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every now and then I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. It wasn't until we reached the car that I noticed something. My heart skipped a beat as I saw the deep gouges on the side of the door, like something had clawed at it. My breath caught in my throat, and I looked at Alex, but he was already getting in, eager to leave. As we drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that twisted figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching us leave. But the road stayed empty. I should have felt relieved when we finally made it back to the main road, but that feeling didn't come. That night, when I finally got home, I went to take a shower, trying to wash off the grime and fear of the woods. That's when I noticed it. A small cut right across my stomach, thin like the edge of a razor. I didn't remember getting it. I ran my fingers over the wound, and as I did, I felt something small, hard, lodged just beneath the skin. With shaking hands, I pulled it out. It was a tooth, and it wasn't mine. I should have known better than to go camping alone. It had been years since I'd gone out into the woods. Work had consumed most of my life, and what little free time I had was spent in front of a screen. So when the idea struck me, driving out to the middle of nowhere, setting up camp and just disconnecting, it felt right. The drive took me 6 hours north, into the heart of the dense, secluded wilderness. I left my phone in the car, not because I wanted to, but because there was no signal this far out. It was just me, the thick expanse of trees and the cool biting wind that seemed to whisper secrets between the leaves. No distractions, no stress, just peace. At least that was the plan. I found a clearing deep in the forest, far from any trails. Perfect. The sun was dipping low by the time I got the tent set up, painting the trees with hues of deep orange and purple. The forest was alive with sounds, crickets, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the occasional distant hoot of an owl. All the familiar, comforting noises of nature. For the first time in months, I felt at ease. As darkness fell, I started a fire. I sat there just watching the flames lick at the cool night air, listening to the wood crackle and pop. The world around me seemed to quiet down with the fall of night. A deep silence settled over the woods. It wasn't unsettling, not yet. It was just still. A twig snapped. I flinched, my head snapping towards the sound. But there was nothing. Just the dark stretch of forest beyond the reach of the firelight. I laughed at myself. Too much city living had made me jumpy. It wasn't until later, as I was lying in the tent trying to sleep, that the real unease began to creep in. You ever have that feeling when you know someone's watching you? I felt it then, that thick, unsettling pressure at the back of your neck. My heart started to race, pounding in my chest. The wind outside had died down, and the crickets had fallen silent. I lay there, eyes wide open, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, listening. Every small sound felt amplified, the rustling of the nylon fabric, the faint creak of a tree branch somewhere in the distance, and then unmistakable footsteps. Not the soft padding of an animal, not the skittering of a squirrel, or the crackle of leaves from the wind. These were slow, deliberate footsteps, heavy, close. They circled the tent. I held my breath, my heart hammering so hard I was sure whoever or whatever it was could hear it. I wanted to move, but I felt frozen, trapped. The footsteps stopped just at the edge of the tent, right by my head. I could hear shallow, uneven breathing. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was some stupid prank, maybe another camper messing with me. But deep down, I knew I was alone out here. After what felt like an eternity, the breathing stopped. The footsteps moved away, slowly, fading back into the woods. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I spent the rest of the night wide-eyed, clutching the knife I'd packed, staring at the thin walls of the tent as if they'd offer me any protection. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When the first rays of sunlight finally broke through the trees, I scrambled out of the tent. The fire had long since gone out, leaving nothing but cold ashes. But that wasn't what froze me in place. Around the camp, in the dirt, were footprints. Bare, human footprints, circling the tent, wandering off into the woods. I hadn't imagined it. I packed up as fast as I could. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind sent a jolt of panic through me. I felt like I was being watched the entire time. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something watching me from between the trees. It wasn't until I was halfway back to my car that I heard it again, the footsteps. But this time, they weren't behind me. They were ahead of me. I froze, my body drenched in cold sweat. Slowly, I scanned the path, and that's when I saw him, standing maybe 50 feet away, barely visible through the trees. A man. His skin was pale, too pale, like he hadn't seen the sun in years. His hair was matted and long, hanging in greasy clumps around his face. But what struck me most were his eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and they were locked onto mine. I couldn't move. He didn't either. We just stood there, staring at each other through the trees. Then, without a word, he turned and walked off the trail, disappearing into the woods. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, to keep walking as fast as I could without breaking into a full sprint. I didn't want to follow him, but he was heading in the same direction I was, back towards my car. When I reached the parking area, it was empty. My car was the only one there, exactly as I'd left it. Relief washed over me as I fumbled with the keys, threw my gear in the trunk, and slammed the door shut. I didn't even bother buckling my seatbelt before I turned the ignition and peeled out of there. I must have driven for hours before I finally pulled over to catch my breath. I was shaking, my mind racing with what I'd seen. Who was he? What did he want? Why had he been watching me? Then I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, sitting in the back seat, staring at me with those same wide, unblinking eyes, was myself. But not me. A twisted version of me. Pale, gaunt, hollow, grinning. Eyes black as night. "I never left," it whispered. "You just forgot." And that's when I remembered. I used to love the wilderness. There was something about getting lost in the vast expanse of trees, hearing nothing but the wind rustling through the leaves, that made me feel free. My friends, Brian, Jess, and I, had been planning this camping trip for months, a weekend away from the noise and chaos of our lives deep in the forest, miles from civilization. We thought it was going to be the perfect escape. I wish we'd never gone. It started like any other trip. We drove for hours until the roads turned to dirt, then parked and hiked further until we were completely isolated. By the time we found a good clearing, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. We set up camp, pitched our tents, and got a fire going. The night came quickly, and the darkness out there was heavy, the kind that makes it hard to see your hand in front of your face if you're too far from the fire. We sat around, talking and laughing, roasting marshmallows. It was perfect, until we heard the first noise. It was distant, a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but not quite. It echoed from deep in the forest, but none of us could pinpoint exactly where. I remember Jess looked at me, her face half lit by the fire, her eyes wide. "You guys heard that, right?" Brian shrugged, trying to laugh it off. "Probably just an animal. We're in the middle of the woods. Relax. But it wasn't the kind of sound you could just shake off. It had a weight to it, something unnatural. Still, we all tried to ignore it, convincing ourselves that it was nothing. We kept talking, but our voices were quieter, our eyes darting to the shadows beyond the firelight more often than before. Then it happened again, louder this time, closer. Jess stood up, her hands gripping the sleeves of her jacket. "We should check it out," she said, her voice shaky. "What if it's something dangerous?" Brian, always the tough one, grabbed a flashlight. "Fine. I'll check it out. You two stay here." I didn't want to let him go alone. I grabbed my flashlight too and followed him, even though my gut was telling me to stay by the fire. The woods were silent, except for the crunching of leaves beneath our feet. The further we got from the campsite, the more oppressive the darkness became. The trees seemed to close in around us, and that strange noise hung in the air, like it was waiting for us. "Do you see anything?" I whispered. Brian swung his flashlight in wide arcs, lighting up the trees and bushes, but there was nothing. No animals, no movement, just the stillness of the forest. My heart was racing, and I kept thinking about Jess, alone back at the camp. We didn't find anything. Reluctantly, we turned back. The silence between us more unsettling than anything we could have found. But when we got back to the clearing, Jess was gone. The fire had died down to embers, the faint glow barely enough to light the area. Her tent was still there, untouched. Her backpack sat by the fire, unzipped, but there was no sign of her. "Jess?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. I called again, louder this time, but all I got in return was that same low growl from deep in the woods, closer than it had ever been. Brian looked at me, and I could tell by his face that he was starting to get scared too. "We need to find her," he said. "She wouldn't just leave like this." We grabbed more flashlights, calling her name over and over as we searched. The forest seemed endless, and every sound, every twig snapping, every rustle of leaves, made my skin crawl. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like eyes were following us from the darkness just out of reach. Hours passed, no sign of Jess. We made our way back to the camp exhausted and terrified, but as we approached, my heart sank. There were footprints, dozens of them, leading from the edge of the woods straight to the fire pit, and then disappearing, as if whoever, or whatever, made them had simply vanished. Brian knelt down, shining his flashlight on the prints. "These aren't hers," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They're too big. Way too big." Suddenly we heard something, a soft rustling like someone moving through the trees. We both turned, shining our lights toward the sound, and that's when we saw it. At first it was just a shadow, a shape barely visible between the trees. But then it moved, slowly stepping into the dim light of the dying fire. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its limbs were long, unnaturally thin. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face... God, its face. It had no eyes, just hollow sockets, and its mouth hung open in a twisted, unnatural smile. Brian froze. I could barely breathe. It stood there watching us, or maybe not watching, since it didn't have eyes, just staring. And then it spoke, or at least it sounded like it was trying to. But the voice that came out wasn't its own. It was Jess's, her voice, pleading, terrified, echoing from that thing's mouth. "Help me, please." Brian took off running before I could stop him. He sprinted into the woods, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he disappeared into the darkness. I tried to follow, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, stuck in place, staring at that thing as it slowly started to walk toward me. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out because the next thing I knew, it was morning, and I was lying on the ground near the dead fire. Brian was gone. Jess was gone. I was alone. The authorities searched the woods for days, but they never found them. No trace, no bodies. Just me, raving about monsters in the forest, They said it was shock, that I must have imagined it. But I know what I saw. Sometimes late at night I still hear that growl.